Chapter 672. The world called him the Silver Storm. He was one of the 12 leaders of the male wizards in Dorora. His name spread across the land before Erewhon was established, and his legend was even older than the songs of the bards. Even the monarchs of the mortal world would tremble in front of him, and even the 4 great temples would have no choice but to retreat in the face of this white-haired old man. He was at the peak of the Silver Mountain, and in front of his pride even giant dragons would have to bow their heads. If there was such a person, his name would be William Pist. The image of this archmage was depicted in folk prints. In the print he wore a silver robe with wavy edges and held the scepter Draka, which meant ruler of the sky in the runic language. He read the 12 rules of Buga to the monks in the sacred palace of the Lionheart. Today he appeared alive in front of everyone. Makarov and everyone else froze. To the nobles of Aween, the Kurlutz Empire's emperor was someone of the highest status. It could be said that he was someone who made people hold their breaths. But William Pist was an existence that only existed in storybooks and legends. In the year of revelation, Chaos 1517, the sacred Palace of Light threatened the male wizards to not participate in the Holy War. Although the Bugas were isolationists, the threat of mortals angered them. 3 months later, in the War of the Month of Flowing Fire, the Bugas retaliated with 3 floating cities. The folk engravings depicted the result of that battle. The Silver Storm engulfed the White Book Knights, the highest combat power of the Templar. One person killed his way into the sacred palace of the Lionheart and read the 12 articles of the Bugas to the 7th Pope, forcing Farnazane to bow his head and admit his mistake. The deterrence of that battle remained in everyone's hearts for a long time, and it lasted until today. I didn't expect it to be you, Master William. Brando stood up and smiled bitterly, as if he was the only one left who could speak. He joked. This is really unexpected. Hasn't the Silver Candle been monitoring the movements in the wilderness south of Madara? I thought the wizards wouldn't be so free. William stopped and gave him a deep look. Then he smiled and said, My young friend Brando, it seems like you know a lot about the sky above Wonde. My pedantic subordinates still think that mortals know little about them, so they can maintain their ridiculous sense of mystery. The Buga mages were arrogant, and they claimed to be the overseers and controllers of Wonde's skies. The runic staff in William's hand was a symbol of one of the highest powers in the Silver Alliance, the mysterious staff Draka. Its fundamental meaning was the authority to rule the skies. Mortals could not touch the sky, so naturally, they would not rashly offend the people of the Silver Clan. Perhaps the dragons would have some complaints about this, but this naturally lazy race would not necessarily go to Roland's door to denounce him for a mere title. Besides, the Silver folk were not afraid of them. To mortals, you are indeed very mysterious. Brando replied with a smile. It's just that I happen to know more about the Magus world. I've heard that the Silver Candle Society has built a fortress south of Erewhon for surveillance purposes. It's called Niosai, right? Are you planning to make a move against Madara? You little fellow, you don't have to beat around the bush to get information out of me. The Silver folk will not intervene in mortal wars. We are monitoring other things. Besides, those skeletons may not be a problem for you. In response to Brando's probing, William was not really angry. Instead, he smiled slightly and answered directly. The reason I'm here this time is only because you've unearthed something incredible. At the mention of the Azure Lance, Brando also quieted down. Something incredible, the Holy Lance of Heaven was indeed one of them. The Azure Knight used the artifact to shatter the heavens. The people and even the players had always thought that it was just a legend, but who would have thought that it really existed in the world? But Brando knew better than anyone else present that the leader of the Dorora mages was probably not here because he was interested in the Azure Lance itself. Sure enough, William continued, but I'm more concerned about the reason for its appearance. The Mercury Staff. Forget it and the reaction you've caused. The appearance of ancient artifacts one by one on the earth has already attracted the attention of many people. Brando listened silently, because he understood that the future era of turmoil was coming. Starting from the rise of Madara, Wonde would be plunged into an era of long-term war. Everything he did in the loop of trade winds was to prepare for the coming war. Many people, including the princess's followers, were quite critical of the compromise they made with the eldest prince this time, but Brando appreciated it very much. Her Royal Highness, like him, seemed to have seen the rolling clouds of war at the edge of the sky. If one only focused on the civil war in front of them, Erwin would be completely overturned in the coming storm. This was the lesson of history, and Brando certainly would not repeat it. Huh. William seemed to have seen through Brando's thoughts and asked with some surprise, "Little fellow, do you know something?" Brando glanced at William. This was his second meeting with the silver-robed leader of the great mages. In his past impression, the leader of the Durora mages, the Silver Storm, was an image of an incomparably majestic NPC, but in his actual experience, William Pist left him with the impression of a very kind elder. Although they did not know each other before, this great mage leader had been of great help to him. The last battle with Andesha, as well as the victory in the War of Ampere Seal this time, was also thanks to the help of Buni's cloak given by the other party. Of course, Brando knew that William's feelings for his past friends and for Erwin were part of it, but he had always been a person who returned a favor, and was not used to owing people favors. In the future, the Bugas would also be involved in the protracted war. The Slate War involved too many forces and was too complicated, and even the Silver Folk would suffer losses. Thinking of this, he raised his head and reminded, "The Sacred War is coming, and the earth will be plunged into the clouds of war." At the same time, the Buga mages should have observed the coming Great Mana Tide. Master William, the rise and fall of the magic tide has affected the ups and downs of Wone's history for thousands of years, and this time will be no exception. There must be signs before the era of chaos, and I think history is already sounding the alarm to the world. When Brando mentioned the sacred war of the mortals, William did not take it seriously. The mortals and the silver folk were two different worlds, and except for the arrogant provocation in the year of Revelation, the sacred war between the four holy cathedrals and the Holy Cathedral of Earth had never affected Buga. But when the former mentioned the Great Mana Tide, the great mage leader's brows gradually furrowed. "Brando, do you think Wone will repeat the history of the War of the Holy Saints?" He turned his head and asked seriously. He had also upgraded the way he addressed Brando from Little Guy to his real name, which meant that at this moment, the great mage leader at least regarded Brando as an equal to himself in a certain sense. The reason was simple. Regarding the coming magic tide itself, the astrologers of Buga had only recently realized that this magic tide was unusual. And just as Brando said, the rise and fall of the magic tide had affected the historical changes of the continent for thousands of years, and any sudden magical attack could completely change the course of Wone's history. Even William had to think carefully about this. It might not necessarily be a repeat of history, it could also be a new danger. Brando thought for a moment and described it in a somewhat euphemistic manner. "Haha," William suddenly laughed. "You sound like a witch from Bunasan when you say that." He suddenly saw the Roman beside Brando, and at first he was startled, then he realized something. "Little guy, have you been studying astrology recently?" Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry at William's joke. The old wizard probably thought that Brando was joking with him, but sometimes when you ambiguously described what would happen in the future, it really sounded like the prophecies of the witches, but if you were to say it directly, you would probably be treated as a fraud. "The dark dragon has already died, but the chaos at the border of civilization may be a problem," William continued. Brando heard this sentence and his heart skipped a beat. It turned out that this was what the wizards of Buga were concerned about. The Silver Candle had built a sky fortress above the Sea of Eternal Darkness to monitor the border south of Erewhon. But it was a pity that they were looking in the wrong direction. Brando recalled the history after the two wars of the Black Rose. In the Year of Silver, the Pale poem said that after 3 days and 3 nights, the eternal night would descend. The law of Tiamat would be completely changed by the magic wave. The war slate would surface on the surface of the water, the calamity of wolves would run rampant across the land, and the era of war would arrive. But he could not say any of these things, and could only hope that William's words would be enough to attract enough attention. This conversation could be said to be confusing to others, and only Princess Grafine and Amandina who knew the inside story could understand a part of it. But the prediction of the future of the continent was not something that they could understand. In fact, with Brando's identity, this knowledge itself was somewhat extraordinary. The nobles only cared about the benefits in front of them, and even Princess Grafine only cared about the rise and fall of the kingdom of Erewhon. The survival of the continent and the changes of history were not things that mortals should be concerned about. But fortunately, William did not seem to want to delve into this topic. Makarov seemed to have finally reacted. From William's words, he could tell that this famous great wizard was here for something important. But he had never heard a word or two about this important thing from any party before today. He looked at Princess Grafine with dissatisfaction. Princess Grafine seemed to be prepared for this and calmly replied, "Oberway Makarov, I did not ask you to come here today, and I will not hide it from you. But this is a matter of great importance and you have to be careful. Please understand." Makarov slightly frowned when he heard this reply. "Mortal, put away your dissatisfaction. She is right. For the miracle that you are about to see, your selfishness is but a speck of dust floating on top of a gem." William suddenly glanced at them and coldly reminded them. His words immediately made everyone fall silent out of fear. The prestige of the leader of the Silver Alliance's great wizard was on full display. Brando then ordered Babasha and the rest to teleport everyone into the underground ruins. They passed through a long tunnel and this time, the Spider Queen seemed to have sensed William's presence. Like an animal's instinct, it allowed these uninvited guests to walk around in its tunnel without showing its head. This made Brando very depressed. You have to understand the frustration of a player bringing along a high-level NPC to kill a boss. But the boss cunningly hides away. The group did not move quickly in the dark. Because they weren't in a state of escape like the last time, everyone was able to relax and carefully observe the surrounding scenery. The underground tunnel was filled with crisscrossing cracks. Some were man-made while some were natural. The cracks spread in all directions, making the entire underground ruins look like a giant spider web. From this point of view, it complemented the owner of this place. Half an hour later, everyone finally arrived at the prayer room from the other day. The prayer room was still the same as that day, immersed in darkness. Even the magic circle was still intact on the ground. William Pist only glanced at the magic circle and said softly, "This is the inheritance of the witches. They really have something to do with that thing. Rumor has it that the Myrnas brought it to the glacier, but in fact the history of the witches is much earlier than the Myrnas." Among everyone, probably only Brando and the demoness Tanya behind the great wizard understood this sentence, and the eyes of the white cat in the Roman's arms also flashed. The great wizard was talking about the history before the fall of Babel Fortress. This was related to which bloodline the Azure Knight had inherited. The great wizard put his hand on the teleportation circle, then frowned and retracted it. This magic circle is also a bloodline inheritance. It can almost be considered the strongest protective measure. He turned to look at Brando and asked, "But you should have prepared the countermeasures, right?" "Of course." Brando turned back. Sugar jar. PS3 consecutive updates of 10,000 words. Continue to make up. Continue to make up. Also from today onwards, please call me 10,000 Strong Baboon. I have opened a Sina Weibo called Eternal Flame FF. Seeking mutual fans, seeking attention. Although there is not much content, but in order to make my IQ fall below the limit, please work hard. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 673. There was a miracle in this world that could not be described with words. Every time he looked up and saw the spear bathed in interweaving lightning, he would have such a thought in his mind. The spear floated in the middle of the hall. Rolling dark clouds surrounded it, and streaks of platinum lightning shot out from the clouds, hitting the spear, and then bouncing off in an arc, dissipating into the darkness. In the dark clouds there was no sound of thunder. Instead, in the silence, everyone saw the scene of heaven and earth collapsing, and the stars falling to the ground. The green light flowed on the floor of the hall, outlining the shadows of every protruding stone. The light changed like flowing water, as if there was a quiet river flowing under the ground. Facing such a scene, even William could not help but change his expression. Makarov and Oberway were even more dumbfounded when they entered the hall. With a clatter, the small staff in Tanya's hand fell to the ground, and the former did not even notice. The Roman looked up, her eyes wide open, and did not care about her image. Freya beside her was also shocked, and the Knight of the Lake was behind her, staring at the spear without saying a word. Maynard, on the other hand, was mesmerized. "This is the azure spear," Brando heard the female knight muttering behind him, and could not help but look back at her strangely, because this reaction was almost the same as his that day, but he did not think too much about it, and just waited for William to finish admiring it. After all, other than these Buga craftsmen mages with extensive knowledge, no one on this continent would dare to say that they were qualified to confirm that this was the real azure spear. The wait was not long. Just a few minutes later, Brando heard William let out a heavy sigh. The old mage seemed to sigh and then said, "This is the real azure spear." There was dead silence. Makarov's reaction was a bit like a mechanical puppet that the Hazel people had sealed underground for many years. He turned his head stiffly and stuttered, "Master, you said this is—" "Shut up, I didn't ask you to interrupt." William interrupted him. Although Makarov was known as the cunning fox of the kingdom, he did not dare to act rashly in front of this big shot. He was slightly stunned and could only force himself to shut up, but his expression was as ugly as it could be. Then the old mage nodded in satisfaction, and he looked back at Brando. "The reappearance of the azure spear may not be a good thing. What do you plan to do with it?" In fact, Brando had already discussed with Tanya, but he could also understand the meaning of the old mage's question. According to the Buga's usual practice, they would completely seal this place after a certain amount of research, to avoid any trouble as much as possible. The Bugas the people of the world were the most in this world. They Bugas the Bugas, and the Buga. It wasn't just Buga, a silver person. In fact, most of the silver people seemed to have this tendency. The silver elves also avoided the world according to a prophecy, and even the gold folk dragons sealed themselves directly in the dragon realm. Only a few young dragons would walk in the outside world. As a player, they couldn't understand the reason behind this. Some players thought that this was a setting in the game for balance. After all, for the iron folk humans and wind elves, the power of the silver folk was really unrivaled. For example, the strongest enemy Brando had ever faced was Andesha, one of the 12 patriarchs of the tree herders in the loop of trade winds. She had already reached the peak of her elemental power, and was close to the realm of a perfect body. But even at this level, she could only be called a little girl in front of the Silver William, regardless of age or strength itself. And William was just one of the 12 leaders of the Wizards of Durora. The Silver Alliance, the Great Library, the White Tower, the Rainbow Scorch, the Warlock Union, the Craftsman's Council, and the disbanded Circle 12 Magic Society. It was because of this terrifying power that the Buga dared to claim to rule the sky and be on an equal footing with the dragons. With this kind of power, even if the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Holy Cathedral of Wind Empress, and the Holy Cathedral of Light joined forces, or even the Holy Cathedral of Nature all for one, and the tree herders, they might not be able to compete. If the Bugas no longer practiced isolationism, the Silver Folk and the Silver Elves would no longer ignore the world. Then the continent of Wond would not have so many kingdoms as it did today, but two major forces opposing each other. So the players thought that the way the Bugas and the Silver Elves thought might have something to do with the game's balance. But Brando didn't think so. He felt that the general silence of the Silver Folk and the Gold Folk might be due to deeper reasons. These reasons were actually only recorded in fragments in history. Brando would rather believe that something had happened in history to make the Silver Folk so cautious. Of course, he didn't have any evidence yet. It was just a guess, and he believed so based on his intuition. The reason was ridiculous, because he believed that the design team of Torrential Rain would not change the game's history, just for the sake of compromising the game's gameplay. So when Brando heard William's words, he didn't answer immediately, but thought quietly for a moment. As the Great Mage said, the reappearance of the Azure Lance was not necessarily a good thing, and could be a huge problem. If he was still a player, then he would definitely get his hands on this thing at all costs. For the sake of an artifact, any player would go crazy, not to mention a legendary existence like the Azure Lance. But now he was no longer just a player. Everything that happened in this world would also affect him and the people around him. But after a short silence, Brando still replied, "Let's do as we agreed before." The old mage stared at him, as if to confirm his thoughts. Brando probably guessed what the King of Wizards was thinking, so he added, "Master William, if this is the course of history, I think it's hard for us to change anything." "Sigh," William sighed. "You don't understand. Forget it, let's leave it at that. You're right, just like the 9 Phoenixes proverb. If there's trouble, there's no avoiding it. Brando was familiar with this proverb, but the background design of the 9 Phoenix originally referred to some of the cultures he was very familiar with. He nodded and replied, "Everyone I've invited here today is closely related to the Battle of Amperseal that day. Starting from Her Royal Highness, let everyone try one by one. Maybe someone here will become the owner of the Azure Lance, so let us witness the birth of this history." Brando, hearing his words, Princess Griffine turned her head. "I'll let you go first." "Me?" Brando was stunned. "Yes, you are my knight. In my mind, only you are the most similar to the Knight of the Azure Lance. I hope that the Azure Lance can choose you." Her Royal Highness replied. "So I want you to try first." Brando was slightly stunned. He did not expect Her Royal Highness to have such high expectations of him. He thought for a moment, nodded to everyone, then raised his head and walked towards the Azure Lance. But before he could take 2 steps, a majestic aura had already pressed down on him. Before Brando had time to see what happened, a figure had already appeared in front of him. Only a few people present saw it clearly at that moment. The figure was clearly born from the intertwining lightning in the sky, and then appeared in front of Brando in an instant with an arc of electricity. At that moment, Brando could express his feelings with only one word: fast. The quality of a swordsman had long been ingrained in his bones. With his current strength and level of swordsmanship, almost no one could get close to him without him reacting at all. Even if it was an existence like William's, Brando could at least react before the surprise attack. However, this attack was clearly not within his expectations. Even including his experience in the game in his previous life, even with the eyes of a veteran warrior who was level 130, he had never seen such a fast attack. But he still saw it clearly. The opponent's starting posture was the classic posture of the Spear Knight in the game. But the Spear Knight would never have such terrifying dexterity. Before he could blink, the lightning spear had already pierced through his chest. Before Brando could confirm that he was injured, his whole body was already flying. At that moment, he finally saw the face of the human figure formed by lightning. But the moment he saw the face, Brando almost screamed out loud. The figure of energy under the outline of the lightning was clearly a woman. Of course, that alone was not enough to make him feel so surprised, because the face he saw was almost exactly the same as the Roman face. Of course, the merchant miss would never raise her pair of beautiful little eyebrows high and put on such a murderous look. With this series of doubts, he fell heavily to the ground. "My lord! My lord!" The Shire and Medisha were the first to react, and a protective spell immediately fell on Brando out of thin air. And the Silver Elf Princess instantly held a spear in her hand, and single-handedly stood between Brando and the Lightning Girl. But the Lightning Girl stopped. She looked at Medisha and threw the spear in her hand. The lightning spear instantly turned into countless arcs of lightning and dissipated into the darkness. She coldly looked at everyone in the hall. Medisha finally saw the other party's face. "Ah, Miss Roman!" she screamed. "Ah!" As if it was a chain reaction, the Roman also stared at the Lightning Girl with a stunned expression. The Lightning Girl was slightly startled and turned her head. As if noticing her movements, Medisha raised the spear in her hand. But at this time, Brando finally caught his breath. "Don't fight with her, Medisha!" Brando released his hand from his chest. The Count's coat was scorched black, but there was no trace of blood. He took a breath and replied, "She doesn't have any killing intent. She seems to be a heroic spirit that protects the spear." "Heroic spirit?" Medisha turned her head. "My lord, whose heroic spirit could she be? How could she look exactly like Miss Roman?" But before Brando could answer, a deep magnetic female voice had already echoed throughout the hall. "My name is Ovina. Who are you, humans, elves, and silver folk? What is your purpose here?" To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 674. This is the third update. It's written at the front. If you didn't notice the first 2 updates, please flip to the front. Ovina. Even Brando couldn't find the origin of this name no matter how hard he tried, let alone the others. Only Roman asked in a trembling voice, How did you impersonate me? Ovina glanced at Roman and paused. I see. Huh? What do you mean? The merchant girl was confused. The lightning girl turned around and frowned at Brando on the ground. You seem to have inherited the authority from the Society of Truth, but you clearly have a higher authority. How strange. Let me see, it's really strange. You have the aura of Gaia's will. She turned her head and swept her gaze over all the others, pausing only for a moment on William. The great mage of the Silver Alliance frowned and didn't say a word, as if he was thinking about something. But Ovina's eyes lit up when she saw Freya, the descendant of the goddess of war's guards. I didn't think this bloodline would still exist in this world, she said with slight admiration. Brando heard the lightning girl's words, of course, but he felt like he was listening to a book from heaven. He had never heard of any of the terms Ovina mentioned. Even in his past experience in the game, there was no mention of this. He frowned. My lady, who are you? You are a heroic spirit. Whose will do you represent? Me. The lightning girl took a step forward and lifted her chin. Human, according to your records, you should call me the Knight of Azure. The Knight of Azure. These 3 words echoed in Brando's mind. He opened his mouth but seemed to have lost the ability to speak. The others weren't any better than him or worse. Medisha almost dropped the spear in her hand. Behind the princess, Makarov and the others kept muttering to themselves. This is impossible, this is impossible. In front of them was the Azure Knight who had shattered the heavens, caused the stars to fall to the ground, and brought about the era of mortals. If one were to ask what was the most famous epic in the history of the Amber Sword, it would definitely be the Pale Poem. If one were to ask which part of the Pale Poem was the most widespread, it would definitely be the legend of the Azure Knight. That was the ancestor of all knight epics. Later generations had made up countless stories based on this legend. Almost all the knights' fantasies had the shadow of this legendary character. But she was actually a woman? Everyone couldn't help but find it hard to accept. Only Roman, after confirming that the other party wasn't pretending to be her, asked curiously. But why do you look exactly like me? Time flows like a long river. Among the billions of stars, there are always 2 that are so similar. This is just a coincidence, the lightning girl replied in a low voice. Brando felt like this lady was spouting nonsense. He asked, Master Knight, may I ask what you meant by what you said before? Ovina glanced at him and answered, You heard what I said, and that's that. What I didn't say I won't tell you. In this world, all secrets have a price. What kind of price do I have to pay? Brando asked with a frown. In the game, the players had been trying to solve a riddle, the final path to the power of existence. Obviously, no one had succeeded, but Brando had a feeling that the term Ovina mentioned before might have something to do with the final door. Because ever since the fall of Babel Fortress, ancient knowledge was lost to the earth. There were no more records of the power of existence. Since then, no matter if it was the gold citizens or the silver citizens, no one had ever truly opened the final door. Even the high and mighty dragon race stopped at the peak of the gold body. Brando looked at Ovina seriously, but the female knight made of lightning shook her head. You can't afford to pay them, human. All right, tell me. What is your purpose for coming here? Purpose? Brando came back to his senses and remembered the purpose of their trip. Master, we accidentally found the azure lance that you once used. We hope to gain its approval. I see. The lightning girl nodded. She looked up at the entire hall. This should be the ruins of Barbert's Great Hall. You probably haven't heard of this name. So to you, what is this place? What year has it been in the outside world? This is now the territory of the Kingdom of Erewhon. It is the underground of a trading port, Ampere Seal. Master Knight, Princess Griffine's voice sounded. This is the first era, the year 376. The Chaos era has ended, the lightning girl muttered to herself. Are there still divine citizens on the earth? Divine citizens? Everyone looked at each other in confusion. What kind of term was that? Even to the players, that was a background that only existed in legends. Ovina looked at their expressions and understood what had happened. However, there was no sadness or joy on her face. She only replied, I see, I understand. She looked up and replied, You said that if you want to gain the approval of the Azure Lance, it's very simple. You just have to defeat me. Defeat you? Brando almost choked on his own saliva. She was the legendary ancient hero who shattered the heavens and ushered in a new era. Legend had it that the Azure Knight was a hero who lived in the era before Babel Fortress was destroyed. She almost certainly had existential power, and even in that terrifying era, her power was at the top of the line. From this, one could tell how terrifying the Lightning Girl's power was. Although he knew that it would not be easy to obtain the Azure Lance, after all, the Amber Sword was first and foremost a game, and since it was a game, there was no such thing as a free lunch. Brando did not expect the conditions of this dungeon to be so simple and yet so demanding. Defeating the Azure Knight's heroic spirit was enough. The question was that even possible? Brando could roughly estimate based on the power of the previous attack. Even if he was at his peak in the game, and with the help of the other top players in the Gracious Knight squad, he might not be able to defeat the Lightning Girl in front of him. He could not help but wonder. He asked, "My lady, may I know, how much power does your heroic spirit have when you were alive?" Ovina smiled slightly. "You are very smart, human. You even know to investigate your opponent's power. But I'm afraid my answer will disappoint you. As long as I am in this hall, my power is equal to my peak power." Everyone felt as if they had been punched in the face. Makarov and the others could not help but look at the legendary mage from the Silver Alliance. But William could not help but smile bitterly. Although his power was close to the peak of the mortal world, it was not enough in the face of the power of existence. He shook his head. There was no chance of winning. This is too much. Princess Grafine was stunned. She could not help but frown as she replied, "My lady, how could anyone defeat you? Little half-elf girl, if you cannot defeat me, what right do you have to use my weapon?" The Lightning Girl smiled and replied. Brando frowned. Unlike everyone else, he immediately felt that there was something wrong with this condition. A game would never set a condition that could not be completed. Her Highness asked a good question. Who could defeat the Azure Knight? Even in his era, which player would dare to claim that they could defeat the Azure Knight, let alone the people present here? Or even further back, as long as they could not control the power of existence, there was no possibility of victory. He immediately thought of something fishy. He raised his head and saw a pair of eyes looking at him. It was a pair of black eyes with a hint of light purple luster. Under the slender eyebrows, together with the beautiful black hair, it set off the heroic and vigorous face. The female knight stared at him. The meaning in her eyes was clear. But she still mouthed a warning. Word trap. Brando reacted immediately. He did not have time to think about why Maynard would suddenly think of this problem. But he had already raised his head and asked Ovina, "My lady knight, are you saying that as long as we are in this hall, your power will be equal to your power at the peak of your power?" The Lightning Girl was stunned and looked at him. Brando already understood. "My lady knight, as long as I defeat you, I will be recognized by the Azure Lance?" "Yes." Ovina nodded. "That's good." Brando suddenly leaped backward and shouted at the Shire beside him. "The Shire Dragon Strike!" The young wizard squire understood the moment his lord spoke. Since Ovina was undefeatable in this hall, then they would change the battlefield. He reached out to the ground and the halo of law magic gathered in his palm, dazzling. "What do you think you're doing?" Ovina's eyebrows, made of lightning, twitched. Then anger flooded her face. "I hate opportunistic people the most." As soon as she finished speaking, her figure completely disappeared from everyone's sight. Then the Roman scream rang out. "Brando, behind you!" Brando's heart went cold. Normally, in a situation like this, the first thing anyone would do would be to attack the Shire to cancel the spell in his hand. But Ovina obviously saw through his relationship with the Shire. In other words, she knew he was a planeswalker. Brando felt a chill run down his back. He didn't even have a chance to fight back. A cold hand that didn't seem to be made of lightning had already grabbed his back. "Order him to stop." The Lightning Girl's voice was frighteningly cold. "No, the Shire cast the spell. There's some kind of law here that she can't hurt anyone." Brando immediately shouted. Ovina paused. "How did you know?" Brando smiled proudly. "Because you just stabbed me with your spear. Did you forget? You noticed?" The Lightning Girl's almost platinum eyes were filled with disbelief. "You're a smart guy, but you think that's enough to make me helpless?" Brando saw the cold, smug smile on Ovina's face and knew something was wrong. He followed her gaze and looked over. In that direction, the beam of light from Charles's dragon strike had already left his hand and hit the ground. The hall was already extremely fragile after countless years. With just one hit, the ground cracked and looked like it was about to collapse. But at that moment Ovina said coldly, "Power of fate, history reversal." Just 8 words. And then a miracle happened. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 675. Power of Fate, History Reversal. Ovina's deep voice echoed in the hall. A strange scene appeared in front of Brando. Time and space were like a series of replays. The ground that had been pierced by the white beam of light reassembled itself. The colorful array of light flowed back. The shattered stone slabs, layers of soil, and rocks were glued back together, seamlessly returning to their original state. Dragon Strike was like a retracted platinum sword that flowed back from the ground and returned to the array of laws in the hands of the stunned the Shire. The rearranged magic flowed back, and was disassembled into the most primitive magic, reversing the entire spellcasting process. This was a scene that had never been seen before. Anyone with a basic understanding of magic would understand what kind of power was contained in this scene. Tanya and William, the 2 outstanding wizards in the crowd, were both shocked and fascinated. Time, space, and energy were the most basic explanations of the laws of the world. This was the power of existence. "There's no way to fight this, boss," the Shire screamed. "You can't defeat me," the Lightning Girl declared proudly. Thousands of electric arcs appeared on her body in an instant. These electric arcs expanded in all directions, each one accurately hitting every single person in the hall. The first to bear the brunt was, of course, Brando, who was being held hostage by Ovina. He was sent flying. Dilfrey, Amandina, and all the non-combat Roman females let out a scream. The expanding electric arcs formed a giant net of light in the hall. One end of the net enveloped every single person and bound them to the wall on one side of the hall. Only William's eyes flashed. He raised Draka, the scepter of the sky, with one hand. A transparent hemispherical shield appeared around his body. Hundreds of golden electric arcs flashed across the magic shield and shattered into countless electric particles like fireworks. The other one who was still standing was Brando. The moment he got up, he activated the talent of the Fool. The blood of God burned fiercely in his body, forming a barrier of willpower that was almost visible to the naked eye around his body. All the lightning disappeared before it could get close to his body. When Ovina saw this, a look of curiosity appeared in her eyes. "This is Odin's aura. There are so many strange things about you. This kind of magic is completely ineffective against me." Brando's Halrangaya was already out of its scabbard. He lifted his head to look at Ovina, who was in the middle of the lightning, and swung his sword at her. "What a joke. Even if he himself came, he wouldn't be a match for me." The Lightning Girl snorted coldly, and in the blink of an eye, all the lightning in the underground hall disappeared into the darkness. Only one beam remained, and that was the lightning spear in her hand. It was as if Ovina had already seen through Brando's attack route. The moment the ghostly blade appeared before her, her spear had already blocked Brando's Halrangaya with a clang. The lightning in her hands was like a substance, and she was able to change the nature of the energy at will. This kind of power had long been extinct in this era. "You also know the sword skills of the dragons. Do you want me to teach you a few moves?" Ovina didn't seem to care about Brando's flash strike sword art at all. She parried Brando's attack with one hand and took a step back, easily maintaining her distance from Brando. Brando actually wanted to say, "Sure," to be able to get the Azure Knight to teach him any skill. Even in the games of his era it would be shocking. But unfortunately, he couldn't say anything because the spear in Ovina's hand was already stabbing at him like a dragon's fang. At that moment he was almost scared out of his wits. The Lightning Girl's spear split into 4, and each one was like the shadow of the moon. This was the ultimate spear skill of the Astral Knight, Silent Knight. A skill with such a literary name, of course, had to be a royal inheritance of the Wind Elves. In fact, it was also one of the secrets of the astral inheritance. But the question was, what about the prerequisite skills for this move? What about the charging time? How come they all disappeared in this woman's hands? Wasn't this a bug? The 4 spear shadows hit Brando's body in an instant. Spear technique. Silent Knight's specialty was like endless darkness. The more he dodged, the more he would pursue. But once he hit, the follow-up attacks would disappear without a trace. But with only 4 spears with Ovina's power level, it was more than enough for Brando to suffer. Even she herself thought that Brando would lose. She didn't expect the lightning spear to pass through a layer of shadow. An illusion? A cold light flashed through the lightning girl's platinum eyes. She saw that Brando's illusion in the air was still advancing and stabbing at her. Huh. This isn't an illusion, it's a magic doppelganger. Ovina's voice was slightly surprised. She took another step back and dodged the attack. She asked in surprise, "This really is a genius sword technique. Did you come up with it?" Brando didn't answer. The 9 luminary sword technique instantly created 4 or 5 doppelgangers. Each doppelganger attacked once. It was as if Brando's sword technique had created multiple shadows around the lightning girl. "TSK, you think you can win like this?" The lightning girl sneered coldly. She blocked all the attacks with clanking sounds and didn't use her right hand from beginning to end. Then she held the spear horizontally and swung it like she was dancing in a circle. This opening move. Dragon Tooth Slash of Steel Scales. Brando's body reacted faster than his brain. He knelt on the ground and leaned back, allowing the lightning spear's blade to graze his chin. Dragon Tooth Slash was known as the most powerful single-target armor-piercing skill. When Ovina used it, it was even more terrifying. The sound the spear made when it sliced through the air was almost like a shriek, so much so that the very air itself seemed to tremble. But Brando knew very well that this skill had a fatal flaw in its attack range. He was very familiar with this skill, so before Ovina even made a move, he had already reacted instinctively. The lightning spear flashed past like a flickering shadow. At the same time, Brando's left hand was on the ground and his right hand was already swinging Halrangaya at the lightning girl with the spear. This move was the simplest and most effective way to deal with a warrior using Dragon Tooth Slash. Of course, it was also the most effective counterattack that the players had come up with after thousands of battles. In the past, every time Brando used it, it was always successful. But Ovina reached out with her right hand and with a creak, she firmly grasped Brando's blade. She used 3 fingers to pinch the pitch-black back of Halrangaya. Brando felt as if the sword in his hand had sunk into steel and couldn't move. The lightning girl smiled. "You have quick reflexes. For someone your age, you have plenty of battle experience." As she finished speaking, she raised her spear and thrust it at Brando. This thrust made Brando's vision go dark. It looked like a normal thrust, but it was clearly the rock resonance spear of the Earth Knight. As expected, as soon as Ovina thrust her spear, the ground beneath the lightning spear trembled and cracked. Rock fragments flew up from the ground and were blown away by the shockwave. Ovina had only attacked 3 times, and each time it was the ultimate skill of a warrior class. But in her hands it was like an ordinary skill. She threw it out one after another as if it didn't cost any money. "This time I've really run into a cheat." That was the only thought that flashed through Brando's mind. He watched as the spear came at his throat, but he couldn't move. The rock resonance spear was the signature skill of the Earth Knight. Its specialty was that it used the power of spatial vibrations to lock onto the enemy's dodging range. In the game it only showed a lack of dexterity, but in Ovina's hands, his dexterity was cut to 0. Was this something a human could do? But at that moment there was a sudden loud boom. The ground beneath Brando's feet cracked. His entire body sank, causing the lightning spear to lose its original target. The spear brushed past his scalp. The lightning girl immediately turned her head. She looked in the direction of the great wizard William and asked coldly, "Earthquake?" William put down the sky scepter in his hand and placed the end of the scepter on the ground. He nodded politely at Ovina. "Yes, Mistress Azure Knight. You want to fight 2 against 1? No problem." Ovina turned around, no longer facing Brando. Instead, she snapped her fingers. Fate, the miracle of time. A strange scene immediately appeared in the hall. Rainbow-colored light shone through the darkness like sunlight through a prism, forming pages of colorful gaps. It was a mesmerizing sight. But Brando, who was in the middle of it all, didn't find it beautiful at all. He only felt that his scalp was in trouble. Because the flowing lights were all gaps in time, The flow of time in the hall was completely disrupted. He realized that both his and William's movements had slowed down. Brando was going crazy. Even if the Azure Knight's element was fate, how could she manipulate time and space so naturally? Since when did the talent of fate add this ability? But Ovina seemed to have seen through his confusion. She answered in a low voice. Those broken pieces of time and experiences are also part of the memory of history. The fate of people describes the world itself. There is nothing that cannot be manipulated by the laws. Your understanding of the elements is still very shallow. Now it's my turn to attack. The lightning girl raised her spear. Endless space seemed to gather at the tip of her spear. In a flash, it formed a singularity that was impossible to see with the naked eye. The singularity had no color. It was pitch black with lightning flashing around its edges. Although Brando had never seen a move like this, he knew that it was no joke. Because this was the first time he had seen Ovina charge up. How did he meet such a freak? Brando didn't know what to say. He turned around and glanced at William. Their only chance of winning was to force Ovina out of the hall. Otherwise, fighting the Azure Knight would be a joke. The Archmage of the Silver Alliance seemed to have realized this as well. He nodded at him. I'll hold her back, Brando yelled. Of course, to be honest, he had no idea if he could succeed. But at least he had noticed that all of Ovina's previous attacks were harmless. This meant that due to some kind of law, this heroic spirit who was guarding this place couldn't kill the challenger. As long as he didn't die, then anything was fine for Brando. The gathering power had already created a whirlwind in the hall. Brando raised his head and glanced at Ovina in the center of the whirlwind. He raised the Halran Gaia and slowly inched towards her. It wasn't that he wanted to move slowly, but Ovina's miracle of time was too freakish. Not only did it slow down time for everyone around her, but it also sped up for herself. It was much more powerful than the legendary 12-circle time imprisonment, spell of the law-defying sorcerers. But Brando knew that he still had a chance. He still had the Flash Strike Sword Art. The Flash Strike Sword Art could ignore space and time. If he got a little closer, he would be able to attack. He raised his head and watched Ovina's every move, hoping that she would be fully focused on casting that ultimate move. Then he would be able to take advantage of the opening. Of course, he didn't expect his attack to do much damage. He only needed to disturb her a little. As one of the 12 leaders of the Drala sorcerers, William's spell casting speed was not to be underestimated, even under the effect of time slowing down. Brando silently estimated the distance. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 676. 10 meters. 7 meters. The sandstorm had completely engulfed the entire hall. The underground hall rumbled and the entire space seemed to be attracted to one point by some kind of force. Brando narrowed his eyes and endured the sharp stones scratching his face. But in the end he found the predetermined spot. The blade flashed slightly. In the next moment, Brando's figure disappeared from where he stood and reappeared beside Ovina. The lightning girl didn't seem to notice. She looked up in surprise, but a trace of mockery flashed through her platinum eyes. Brando observed her expression and immediately realized that something was wrong. Shallow. Before he could swing the Halran Gaia in his hand, he heard Ovina's cold comment. In the next moment, Brando felt the sword in his hand hit an indestructible wall with a clang. The wall was transparent, as if the blade of the Halran Gaia was stopped 3 feet away from the lightning girl. What is this? Brando was horrified. He had never heard of a skill that could give the caster a layer of mana shield when it was being used. How was he supposed to survive? This is not a magic shield, human. Ovina raised the tip of her spear and pointed it at his chin. She answered calmly, because you cannot defeat me. This is your destiny, like a predetermined destiny. That is why you are hesitating. Brando immediately understood that this was also one of Ovina's elements. This was another manifestation of the power of destiny. It planted a subconscious thought in the hearts of all her enemies, making them believe that they could not defeat her. In other words, there was no magic shield around her at all. It was because he believed that he could not defeat her, so his sword stopped there. Everything was just an illusion. But this illusion was so real that it was impossible to resist. Even if Brando used all his strength, his sword would always be stopped 3 feet away from the lightning girl. It was as if he was fighting himself. This kind of power was unbelievable. Never mind since he transmigrated to this world. Even in his previous life in the game, he had never heard of such a thing. He had often heard other players speculate about how terrifying existential power was, but now it seemed that it was even more terrifying than they imagined. Understood? Ovina asked. Brando smiled bitterly. This was indeed an undefeatable power, because he saw that the girl surrounded by lightning had already begun to accumulate the last of her strength, preparing to unleash her attack. At this time, the mages from the Silver Alliance had just started chanting their spells. Brando turned around and saw William's serious expression. But it was at this moment that a figure appeared in Brando's vision behind the endless storm. A figure that he couldn't even imagine in his dreams. It was a long flame-like ponytail. Her long hair fluttered in the wind as her master pushed forward, curling around the spear in her hand. It was just a standard pike of the White Lion Legion. It couldn't even be considered a magical weapon. But the tip of the pike reached Ovina's back in an instant. It was Scarlet. The girl of lightning acutely sensed the sneak attack from behind her. With a backhand chop, she sliced half of the pike in Scarlet's hand. She turned around and looked at Scarlet in confusion. That's strange. Such weak power. How did you escape from my lightning cage? Because I'm lightning too. The girl with the ponytail roared. Let go of the Lord. I see. Ovina had already seen the electric arcs floating around Scarlet's body. She raised her eyebrows slightly. Such pure power of lightning. You also have God's blood in you and it's Kaisu's. But unfortunately, it's far from enough. As soon as she finished speaking, she had already sent another chop towards Scarlet's neck. The Azure Knight's heroic spirit had probably seen through Scarlet's meager power and decided to take care of her first. Careful. Brando was still beside Ovina. He now knew that attacking the heroic spirit of the Azure Knight was pointless. As long as he couldn't break through the element of fate, he wouldn't be able to chop off her neck even if she offered it to him. But if he wanted to interfere with Ovina's movements, he had many ways. Brando dodged the girl of lightning and swung Haurangaya downwards. He roared, "Rise, power of the earth!" The power on Haurangaya suddenly exploded. The floor of the hall seemed to be bursting with layers of cracks. The floor under Ovina's feet was about to be completely torn apart. Ovina was furious. She had no choice but to retract her chop. She pressed her hand downwards and released another time reversal. This hall was her biggest weakness. Of course she wouldn't let Brando tear it apart. But as soon as she turned around, the girl with the ponytail behind her found another opportunity to attack. She didn't care that she was less powerful than an ant in Ovina's eyes. She didn't say a word. She held the standard pike with the chopped-off head and stabbed it towards Ovina's back. "Scarlet, get out of the way!" Brando shouted helplessly. He knew that Ovina's elemental power was very special. Even he couldn't do anything to her, let alone Scarlet. If Scarlet stayed, she would only be a burden to him. But it was too late. Scarlet and Brando's relentless attacks infuriated even Ovina, who had a good temper. More importantly, the magic power that William the Great Wizard was accumulating was slowly becoming a threat. Of course, with William's power, it was impossible for him to hurt her. But if he was determined to destroy the hall, it would be a time-consuming and laborious task for her to fix. A waste of energy and time. The girl of lightning finally commented coldly. At the same time, she turned her pike and stabbed it towards Brando. Ovina was very rational. Scarlet obviously posed no threat to her. In comparison, Brando, who had Haurangaya in his hand, was more of a problem. But as soon as she thrust her pike, she immediately realized that she had made a huge mistake. Because she immediately felt Scarlet's pike hit her squarely in the back. Ovina's eyes were filled with disbelief. How could a mortal who wasn't even at the peak of gold hit her? Where was her talent of fate? Scarlet had used all her strength to strike Ovina's back. She didn't even scratch the heroic spirit's skin. Instead, she herself was sent flying. But according to the power of the precepts, whether or not this attack caused any damage, it had completely interrupted Ovina's charging skill. With a bang, the black singularity on the Azure Knight's heroic spirit pike completely disappeared. An opportunity. Brando didn't know how Scarlet had been able to pierce through Ovina's elemental power, but at least he knew that this was a perfect opportunity. While the Girl of Lightning was distracted, he had already raised Halrangaya and stabbed it down. With a loud crack, the power of the earth that had been nurtured by the sword instantly spread throughout the floor of the hall. Immediately, dense cracks appeared on the flagstones on the ground, and the earth cracked under the flagstones. The underground hall rumbled and tilted to one side, seeming as if it was about to collapse completely. What the hell? Ovina finally reacted. Even though she claimed to have the power of the Azure Knight at her peak, Brando could tell that this heroic spirit had only inherited the power of that legendary hero. But her battle experience and her ability to handle the battlefield were far inferior. Seeing that the hall was about to collapse, the Girl of Lightning began to panic. She opened her arms and a vast amount of elemental power instantly enveloped the entire underground hall. The entire hall collapsed and then immediately recovered. But then more cracks appeared. Ovina's forehead was covered in cold sweat. She slowly realized that she couldn't hold on any longer. Because William the Silver Storm had joined the battle, the magic of an extended earthquake spell was injected into the ground, causing the entire hall to tremble. The pillars in the hall cracked and the ground began to move. Then a large fissure appeared and sank, sliding into the cracks beneath the ruins along with countless rocks. The Girl of Lightning seemed to have finally realized that defeat was inevitable. But she gritted her teeth and raised her head. She said angrily, "Don't think that you've won." The entire hall was falling apart into countless pieces. Ovina stood under the largest rock and looked down at Brando and Scarlet. She reached out her hand and retracted the elemental power that had enveloped the entire space. Then she shouted, "Destiny, the shining fountain." History unfolded behind her like a curtain. Countless heroes and legends came to life in those shining fragments and then appeared before Brando. There were some characters that Brando couldn't even name, but there were also some from the era after the Azure Knight. Among them, Brando recognized the four wise men, mainly because he was too familiar with the image of the Saint Tossel. These summoned creatures formed from fragments of history. Brando couldn't even describe their state of existence. Rather than heroic spirits, they were more like the manifestation of a law. But clearly, these things that Ovina summoned were not here to have a tea party with him. The Girl of Lightning pointed her spear downwards. Her deep, penetrating voice almost drowned out the rumbling of the collapsing hall. Heroes are merely beings bound by fate and wishes. Their goal is to ensure that the fate of the world continues to exist along a predetermined line. Human, accept their challenge. More than 10 projections of heroes that seemed to have walked out of legends rushed towards Brando. Brando's face was pale with fright. Although he didn't know how much power these summoned creatures had, if they were too weak, Ovina probably wouldn't have let them out. The elemental power of fate was a bug. Brando immediately revised the order of the elemental power in his mind. In the past, there had been quite a few players who had the gift of fate in the game. But he didn't expect this elemental power to be so freakish when it reached the realm of the power of existence. It was as if he could get anything he wanted. The first to reach him was Saint Tossel's illusion. He didn't know if it was a coincidence, but the Wind Empress had clearly demonstrated the power she should have. Brando was just about to raise his sword to parry the elf's attack when Saint Tossel stepped back and a series of illusions appeared in front of him. 9 Luminaries Sword Art. Brando immediately realized that his 9 Luminaries sword art was nothing compared to the real Saint Tossel. First of all, their magical powers weren't on the same level. The Wind Empress in front of him seemed to be able to continuously cast 9 Luminaries sword art. And each illusion lasted for a very long time, making it difficult to distinguish between the real and the fake. And that wasn't the end of it. Next to him was the Flame King, Gretel, who was ready to attack at any moment. Brando's Flash Strike sword art had left a deep impression on him. But luckily, Brando still had one last trick up his sleeve. The hall was disappearing beneath everyone's feet. He took a step back and grabbed the ponytailed girl's arm. Scarlet paused and instinctively pulled back her hand. "My lord, we can't win. Let's run," Brando answered. He never had the self-awareness of being an expert. He raised his head and took one last look at Ovina, who was at the very top. More and more heroes were emerging from the screen of light behind her. It made his scalp go numb. There was no way to win. He didn't know which idiotic designer had designed such a scene. What made him even angrier was that this design actually existed in this world as well. Was there any scientific basis for this? Brando shook his head and shouted in the direction where William had been. Master William will be going first. With that, he immediately grabbed Scarlet's hand and jumped into the darkness below. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 677. Brando swore that if he had known what it felt like to be buried under sand, he would have surrendered rather than run away. At first, he felt his body falling rapidly in the darkness. Countless objects fell around him, accompanied by the sound of the wind. There was only a faint light above his head, which should be the direction of the collapsing underground hall. About a second or two later, he felt a violent impact. A normal person would have been smashed to pieces under such an impact, but it was nothing to a peak gold tier physical strength. Brando only felt that he had hit a slope, and then rolled down along the sharp rocks. He tried to grab onto something, but it was futile in the darkness. A large amount of sand rolled him down until he hit a flat rock. Brando felt the first impact, and then the second impact was a soft body hitting him. He immediately realized that it was Scarlet. More rocks and sand were falling from above. Brando hurriedly pulled the girl down, and then turned around to block in front of her. In just a split second, there was a loud rumble as several huge rocks smashed heavily onto his body. Of course, this was nothing to Brando. It felt like he was hit by a few sticks, but the large amount of sand made him suffer. He coughed and his mouth was full of sand. But this was not the most tragic experience. The key point was that when he lowered his head and subconsciously wanted to spit out the sand in his mouth, he met a pair of bright eyes. It was a pair of quiet, curious, and shy eyes. Obviously, it belonged to a mountain girl who liked to keep her hair in a long ponytail. Scarlet was under Brando's protection, and she obediently looked at her lord without moving. For both Brando and Scarlet, it was not difficult to see in the dark. Both of them could clearly see each other's state. But fortunately, it was not the first time they had encountered such a situation. The last time they were chased by the misty nightmare in the loop of trade winds, they had experienced almost the same situation. After the first experience, at least the second time was not as awkward. My lord, Scarlet whispered and blinked. Thank you. Woo-woo. Brando's mouth was full of sand, and he was unable to speak. His face was almost touching Scarlet's. He couldn't spit sand on her face, could he? Rumbling sounds were still coming from outside. It was clear that the collapse would not end anytime soon. But Brando did not answer, and the mountain girl looked at him carefully. After a while, Brando suddenly felt Scarlet move, and then gently leaned her forehead against his chest. This seemingly unintentional action made Brando's heart skip a beat. He subconsciously lowered his head and saw Scarlet curled up in his arms like a child. Qian? I'm sorry. Scarlet seemed to have been awakened by his voice. She was startled and quickly let go of his hand. Brando looked at her carefully, shrinking back, and couldn't help but feel sorry for her. Actually, it's okay. Are you scared? Scarlet frowned and shook her head slightly. Brando was silent for a moment. To be honest, he could not tell what this girl was thinking. Since the Battle of Ampere Seal, Makarov had come to see her a few times, but she had rejected him. Scarlet was usually quiet and only occasionally accompanied the Roman, but according to the other members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, she was not like this in the past. He thought for a moment and felt that he was not suited to guess a girl's thoughts. After all, he was a complete loser when it came to that in his last life. He shook his head and decided to change the topic. Scarlet, how did you break through Ovina's element? The mountain girl paused and looked up at him curiously. You don't know? Brando was stunned. Of course, he could see that Scarlet's expression was genuine. Scarlet shook her head in confusion. That's strange. Brando was even more confused than Scarlet. He knew the power of Ovina's element of fate. Ovina's element of fate was similar to a speech spirit, but it was much more powerful. If you could not break through your own fate, then you would never be able to defeat her. You might not even be able to attack her. But the problem was, as a gold level being, It was an impossible task to break free from the element of a legendary hero who had mastered the power of existence. Even the Silver Storm Master William would not be able to do it, much less him or Scarlet. Could it be because of the dragon bloodline? But he had never heard of a gold person being able to challenge someone of a higher level. It could only be said that they were more talented. Brando frowned and couldn't figure it out, but at that moment he suddenly felt something. He looked up and realized that the sound of the falling rocks had quieted down. This was undoubtedly the best news for him at the moment. He hurriedly threw away the messy thoughts in his mind. He stretched out his hand and easily lifted the rock that was pressing down on him. With another push, the gravel rolled down into the darkness along with the sand and sand. Brando climbed out of the rubble in no time, and then rescued Scarlet from the rubble. The two of them finally reached a flat rock. They looked around and realized that the collapsed hall had formed a giant hole. They were in the middle of this hole. Above their heads, any signs of human activity had long disappeared. Brando looked around. In theory, when the hall collapsed, besides him and Scarlet, William and Ovina should have been caught in the mud and sand. The others were bound to the wall by the lightning cage and shouldn't have been in too much danger. But Brando strained his eyes to find William and Ovina's silhouettes in the darkness, but he couldn't find any of them. That's strange. He paused slightly. According to Ovina and William's powers, they should have been able to escape earlier than he was. The collapse from before looked dangerous, but for beings of their level, it shouldn't have been much trouble at all. My lord, look over there. Scarlet stood beside Brando without saying a word after being dragged out of the rubble. But as a half-dragon, her eyesight was obviously much better than Brando's. Brando looked in the direction she pointed. After a while he saw a dot of light flying out of the darkness. But when the light came closer, he realized that it wasn't a dot of light at all. It was William flying in midair, holding a glowing staff in his hand. And when he got closer, Brando suddenly saw that the old magician was carrying a person in his hand. From the platinum body made of lightning, who else could it be but Ovina? William's flying spell was extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, he was right in front of Brando. He descended, his long robe fluttering in the air, and then landed firmly in front of Brando. He reached out and threw Ovina in front of Brendel. She's unconscious? Brendel's jaw dropped as he stared at Ovina, whose eyes were tightly shut. He couldn't believe that this was the mighty Lord heroic spirit from before. Normally, as long as one's body was complete, even if one fell from a height of several thousand feet, one shouldn't have fainted. This was too degrading. You guessed right, little one. After leaving that hall, her power weakened rapidly, the old magician replied. When I found her, she was at most an upper silver level, and her magic was still draining away. I can foresee that if this continues, she won't even be able to maintain her original form. I see. Brando paused, but then he felt a little troubled. He couldn't help but look at the lightning girl on the ground and say, so what's the situation now? Did we win or lose? This girl isn't going to go back on her word, is she? Ahem. What do you take me for? Brando had just finished speaking when the unconscious Ovina on the ground suddenly woke up. Although she still looked a little weak, she still glared at Brando and said, although I hate opportunistic people the most, a win is a win. I won't deny it. The girl panted, and then her face became much rosier. Brando and William both frowned slightly, because at the same time, they realized that Ovina's power seemed to have increased. You can still recover your power? Brando couldn't help but ask. Wasn't that hall destroyed? Wait, you. He narrowed his eyes as if he realized something, but the silver magician leader was one step ahead of him, and a look of realization appeared on his face. At least you have some smarts, Ovina snapped. Ovina replied in annoyance. It's just as you guessed. My power doesn't increase the closer I get to the hall. Instead, the closer I got to the Holy Lance of Heaven, the closer my power was to its peak. I'm sure you've guessed it. I'm not some azure knight. I'm the heaven. Ha! Brando felt as if he had been punched in the face. So you're saying that everything that happened before was a self-directed act? Not entirely. As a divine artifact, of course I have the right to choose my owner. Ovina lifted her chin and answered proudly. All right, that has nothing to do with us anyway. Brando shrugged. It wasn't the first time he had seen a magical equipment with a soul. The ring of the Wind Empress on his hand had a heroic spirit sealed in it during the War of the Holy Saints, not to mention that many famous magical equipment in the Amber Sword had similar mechanisms. However, it was the first time he had seen a heroic spirit sealed in a ring that was so powerful. But the more it was like this, the more it proved the value of the heaven. He thought for a moment and continued, "No matter what, you admit that we won before, right? So now you can choose who your owner will be, right?" "Yes," Ovina answered through gritted teeth. "But before that, I have a question. I want to know how she was able to pierce through my elemental power." The girl in lightning form looked at Scarlet on the side. Her face once again filled with disbelief. Like Brando, she couldn't figure out how a gold rank could ignore the influence of her elemental power of fate. Brando glanced at Scarlet and thought for a moment. Maybe it's because of her dragon bloodline? Impossible. Ovina denied without hesitation. She's just a gold person. Since when did their bloodline have such power? Unless some genetic mutation happened in the past 10,000 years, but the chances of that are too small. Genetic mutation. Brando chewed on this word by word. Did the Amber Sword have such a setting? But the girl in lightning form only snorted coldly and didn't answer him. The darkness seemed to fall silent again until the Archmage William thought for a moment and said, "Maybe I know why?" Everyone turned to look at him. In our history, there are some things that can allow people to change their fate and break free from the shackles of fate. The Archmage answered slowly. "Brando, you know that little girl Alaz, right?" "Ah," Brendel suddenly exclaimed with a look of sudden realization. "So that's how it is, I got it. P.S. The Mighty Baboon is at it again. Please don't mind the wrong title of the second chapter. Anyone who cares about details is an idiot. Keep following me on Weibo." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 678. So what's going on? Ovina asked with a frown, still half kneeling on the ground. She rubbed her arm with one hand and frowned. The girl's energy body looked like it was made of platinum. The white irises in her eyes were like translucent rings. Only when they contracted slightly could one guess what she was thinking. She was obviously very angry right now. The reason is actually very simple. Brando grinned. His voice echoed in the darkness with a hint of playfulness. He suddenly raised his hand and placed it behind Scarlet, pushing the girl who had been standing in the shadows with her head lowered in front of him. "Lady Ovina, you must have heard of the legend of the fairy's golden apple, right?" Scarlet seemed a little nervous. She turned to look at her lord in surprise. But Brando shook his head at her, indicating that she need not be nervous. He did this in hopes that Scarlet would leave a deeper impression on Ovina, because Ovina would definitely choose the successor of the Holy Lance of Heaven from the three of them. He himself was more accomplished in swordsmanship, and William's identity and profession were not suitable to be the successor of the Azure Lance. Therefore, he hoped that Ovina would choose Scarlet as the successor of the Azure Lance. Most importantly, he hoped to give Scarlet courage and confidence, so that this Highlander girl would understand that no one's existence in this world had to rely on others. He hoped that Scarlet would have her own thoughts and destiny, to pursue her own dreams. A Scarlet who would always stand behind him, like a silent shadow. This Scarlet made his heart soften. But it was also because of this that he hoped the girl would understand that there was no such thing as a lowly background in this world. A girl from the countryside of Bucci could also become the hope and protector of many people in a certain era. Only confidence and hard work were the driving forces of every individual's progress in civilization and order. Ovina took a closer look at Scarlet. Her pupils were like burning platinum flames, and her eyebrows were like extended flames. She frowned slightly. Is this the reality of longing? She closed her eyes and sniffed. So that's how it is. She does have the unique scent of the fairies. The residents of Valenia's home of the fairies have been researching ways to change fate for a long time. I didn't expect them to succeed, but it's only breaking the laws. It's still useless to advance in chaos. I was too careless. Then she opened her eyes again. She looked at Scarlet and then at Brando. I heard her call you Lord. Is she your subordinate? Oh no. Brando thought Ovina was going to hold a grudge against him and hurriedly explained, "I guess you could say that." "Barely." Ovina stared at Brando suspiciously and dragged out her words. Brando pondered for a moment and quickly organized his words. "It's probably because I helped Scarlet when she was in trouble, so nominally, Scarlet is now by my side as my guard. Of course, you can also think that I'm forcing her to return the favor, but no matter what, the contract between us will continue until she feels that she has repaid the favor." "Lord." Scarlet turned around and called out softly. Brando's self-deprecation obviously made her nervous. Brando hurriedly gave her a look. Ovina looked at the two of them with slight disdain. "How clumsy. But I didn't know you had some kindness in you. But don't you think it's a bit inappropriate for me to acknowledge her? It's not just that she's weak, because that's not the point. The point is that she doesn't have the heart to become strong. Without confidence, she can't look at herself. How can she realize her beliefs? Maybe she's even confused about her beliefs. The azure lance in her hands will only bury me." She stared at Scarlet, who lowered her head in silence. Then Ovina turned around and looked at Brando with some admiration. "You, on the other hand, although you're still weak, you already have some potential." "That's true. Otherwise, that guy wouldn't have chosen you, right? Haven't you noticed that you have a temperament that doesn't fit in with this world? And it's because of this temperament that you have the possibility of changing history. What do you think? Do you want to consider making a pact with me and becoming the new master of the Azure Lance human?" Brando was slightly taken aback. He didn't expect Ovina to acknowledge him. But he sighed and shook his head. "You're wrong, Lady Ovina. No one is born strong, and no one is born to change the world. But at every moment, everyone will change themselves for some reason. As long as there's something important in your heart that needs to be protected, anyone can become strong. In this world, strength and weakness have never been a constant factor. I've seen Scarlet's anger over her dead companions. It's because of that anger that I believe she can do it." "Scarlet, raise your head. You've defeated Lady Ovina, so you also have the right to be acknowledged by the Azure Lance," Brando ordered firmly and sternly. Scarlet trembled. She bit her lip and raised her head to look at Brando. She knew that it was the Azure Lance, the most dazzling existence in the legends. Her Highness the Princess, His Lordship, and even Count Yenbao. There were many people here who were more qualified than her to pick up the holy lance that had once shattered the Azure Lance. Her Highness the Princess was brave, His Lordship was righteous, and Miss Dilfrey was determined and full of ideals. Everyone here seemed to be better than her. The Azure Lance could belong to any one of them, but how could it belong to her? But even so, there was still a trace of indescribable gratitude in the depths of her eyes. That gratitude was because she was touched by the acknowledgement. The darkness was controlled by solitude for a moment, and it silently spread out. William stood beside the three of them. Under his silver eyebrows, his wise eyes revealed a look of interest. It was as if it had nothing to do with him. He only occasionally used his fingers to sweep the dust off his long sleeves. As a wizard, he had no interest in the ownership of the Azure Lance to begin with. Ovina couldn't help but groan. She was probably grumbling about the fact that she had been defeated by a little girl like this. She couldn't help but look at Brando with some annoyance. "You really want her to pick up the Azure Lance? Can't she? There are many others in the Great Hall. They are even more suitable than her. That half-elf girl, she is calm and collected. And that little woman dressed like a merchant who came with you, she has a noble bloodline. There are a few others. Although they aren't as good as these two, at least they are much better than her." Ovina frowned. "I really don't understand your thinking. I know that, but I still think Scarlet is better." "You?" The girl of lightning stammered. "Why? Because she is ordinary. That's why she can turn from a cocoon into something magical. In a time in the past, the Knight of the Azure Lance once used the Holy Lance to shatter the Azure Lance, causing the stars to fall to the ground. In the end, it brought about the Age of Mortals. Lady Ovina, in Kurlet's history, the Azure Lance represents an endless struggle. Even the lowliest of existences can stand at the pinnacle of glory. Because of this, the Age of Mortals is filled with color." Brando answered slowly. Ovina was speechless for a moment. She glared at Brando. The sound of clapping finally rang out. William clapped his hands lightly and answered, "Well said. The age of silver and gold has long passed. Mortals have to control their own destinies. Lady Ovina, honestly speaking, none of us here have the right to inherit the azure lance. But in comparison, sometimes a coincidence might be Martha's will? All right, I understand. Ovina sighed and stood up from the ground. She looked at Scarlet and extended her hand. You are very lucky, little girl. Come, extend your hand. Let me see what you are thinking. Scarlet hesitated for a moment and turned to look at Brando. But Brando only nodded slightly at her. Okay. The Highlander girl seemed to have finally gathered all her courage. She bit her lip, then extended her hand and placed it in Ovina's palm. Ovina closed her eyes and her sword-like brows finally relaxed. For the first time, a peaceful expression appeared on her face. So this is your past. It is better than I imagined. But it is only a temporary setback. It is not an excuse for people to be weak. The azure lance is a sharp blade that protects the mortal world. Scarlet, the shattering of the heavens and the falling of stars. This is the history of mortals conquering their destinies. Can you feel the courage contained in all this? Yes. You want to protect? Ovina suddenly asked. Then there was a short silence. Scarlet did not answer. But after a while, Ovina suddenly opened her eyes. She turned to look at Brando in confusion. The strange meaning in those platinum eyes made even Brando pause. But when he looked again, Ovina had closed her eyes again. Open your heart and accept me, Scarlet. Ovina chanted. From this day onwards until the final day comes, Scarlet repeated. The contract is established. A pillar of white light and a green halo spread out from the darkness. Like an invisible wind, it lifted the Highlander girl's long hair. Scarlet suddenly screamed, because she saw Ovina turn into the purest white light in front of her and merge into her chest. Everyone saw this scene. Out of all of them, only Makarov, who was bound to the wall by lightning, had the most complicated expression. He probably could not understand why Brendel would give up the opportunity to sign a contract with the Azure Lance, and give this unprecedented divine weapon to his adopted daughter who was not particularly outstanding. The princess frowned slightly, but quickly understood. Dilfrey was curious. Among everyone, the only one she liked was the merchant girl, who was bound tightly by lightning. It wasn't that Ovina was giving her special treatment. It was just that the merchant girl was too dishonest. Plus, the Witch Queen's inheritance in her bag was not to be underestimated. But even so, Roman said happily to the white mist on his shoulder, I knew Scarlet would be the most suitable. Last night I even made a bet with Brando. Because among us only Scarlet uses a gun, right? That me is so stubborn, unlike me who guessed the result right away. Scarlet and that gun are so compatible, so beautiful. When I have time I must borrow it from her and play with it. White Mist yawned. She was too lazy to answer her. And too lazy to remind the merchant girl that Medisha also used a gun. Even though Medisha was a heroic spirit, Roman probably didn't think that far ahead. On the other side, in the darkness, after the seemingly endless light dissipated, Ovina had turned into thousands of lightning bolts. The platinum lightning gathered into a bundle in Scarlet's hand. When the light faded, all that was left was a shining spear. Upon closer inspection, it was the Holy Lance of Heaven. Scarlet stared blankly at the pale green holy spear that was like jade. She couldn't react in time. Lady Ovina. The holy lance in her hand buzzed. This is her. Brando walked forward and stared closely at the legendary holy lance. Ovina is the will of the holy lance. But your power is still too weak, so I'm afraid you won't be able to sense her presence for the time being. As he spoke, he lifted his head. Without Ovina's power restraining them, the lightning cages in the hall dissipated. The remaining magic brought everyone down slowly, landing not far from Brando and the others. The merchant girl, who was the first to land, immediately shouted in surprise, Brando! Then she hurried over. My lord! Brando! Mr. Brando! After that, Medisha, the Shire, Freya, and Princess Grafine all gathered around the three of them. Of course, without exception, everyone's eyes fell on the Holy Lance of Heaven in Scarlet's hand. This was the weapon that pierced through the heavens in the ancient legends. The Roman couldn't help but blink and ask curiously, Brando, is this lance really as powerful as the legends say? Is this lance really as powerful as the legends say? This was undoubtedly the question in everyone's mind, including Brando. He thought for a moment, then walked forward and placed his hand on the blade of the Holy Lance of Heaven in Scarlet's hand. Scarlet paused and looked up at him in confusion. "My lord?" Brando didn't answer immediately. He had already seen a pale green screen of light extend from the tip of the lance. Holy Lance Divine Weapon Attack. 112-147 plus 45 Strength, plus 45 Dexterity, plus 45 Vitality, plus 45 Bloodline, plus 45 Senses. Additional skills. Fate. A legend that has accumulated over time on the spear. It is like an eternal fate that curses its enemies. Any target hit by the Holy Lance will continuously bleed from the wound due to the curse, dealing 11 points of damage per second. This damage can be stacked repeatedly. Holy Lance. Pure wind elements surround the blade of the lance. The wielder can summon the power of lightning. Every time the wielder attacks, they can copy the power of lightning to deal the same amount of damage to enemies in any direction. The amount of lightning depends on the magic of the wielder. Divine Weapon Domain. Undefeatable Fate. An invisible force protects the Holy Lance. Any attack that is lower in power than the wielder will be weakened by 90%. The ability to change fate is immune to this effect. Brando narrowed his eyes slightly when he saw these rows of attributes. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 679. The changing of the seasons went on unhurriedly around the port of Ampere Seal. The increasingly dense forest began to cover the green hills, and the excavation work outside the port could not completely cover up the news. Since the Buga craftsman left, the rumors about the Azure Lance still spread. What an eventful time. Wood rubbed his eyebrows and stared at a page of letter on the mahogany table. The paper was snow-white and came from the eastern part of Cruz, adjacent to the forest border of the four-leaf clover. There was still a faint burnt smell in the corner of the letter, which was the unique trace of the magic imprint left by the flame magic. Before this imprint was erased, it should have been 4 pairs of eagles with their wings spread, representing the Holy Cathedral of Fire, or rather, the highest level of confidential documents in the Cruz Empire. He looked up and sat at the mahogany table for a while, staring at the opposite wall under his thick eyebrows. For a moment, his eyes seemed a little illusory. Then the former Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral suddenly ignited a golden flame in his hand. He shook his hand gently, and the charred letter suddenly turned into ashes. Wood carefully tidied up the embers on the table, then straightened up and tidied up his golden priest robe. The news in the secret letter confirmed the news that had been circulating in the port in recent days, but in fact, he had already learned all the relevant information from the young Count Tonagel. The people of Erewhon did not intend to hide it from him, or at least did not intend to cover up the apparent fact. The Azure Lance did exist in Ampere Seal, but it was meaningless because the Buga people had already taken it away. Wood's expression was uncertain, and his mind was repeatedly trying to figure out the information contained in this incident. He didn't know if it was the decisiveness of the little princess of Erewhon, or the shrewdness of the young count, but the benefits they had exchanged with the Azure Lance from the Buga people were very obvious. He couldn't help but look back and cast his gaze out of the window. Outside the window was the light red undulating roof of the port of Ampere Seal. Emerald green vines hung down from the glass, splitting the sunlight sprinkled on the mahogany table into strange shapes. This was really a vibrant city, but now it no longer belonged to the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Wood did not feel anything about this matter. The temple had made a mistake and should pay the price for it. The key was that at least this kingdom still believed in the way of the golden flames, and their people did not deviate from their reverence for the Holy Cathedral of Fire. As for secular interests, Wood had never been too concerned. However, what really worried him was the inner circle of the Holy Sanctum. No, it should be said that the upper echelons of the empire coveted the Azure Lance. Greed could blind a person's heart, and this was especially true for the nobles. Even he himself had suffered greatly from it. However, judging from the words in the letter, His Majesty the Emperor himself should also be interested. After all, it was the Azure Lance, the most famous weapon in the Pale poem. At this level, it was no longer something he could change. In the past, he might have been able to come up with some solutions when he was the Archbishop, but now it was not something he could worry about. He could only hope that the people in power within the Holy Cathedral of Fire could be more rational and see the true teachings of the Flame King. He sighed, took off the Archbishop's square hat and put it on his head, then opened the door. The knight loyal to the holy sanctum had already been waiting outside. His deputy was no longer the former Friar Get. Since he became the liaison between the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Erewhon royal family, his deputy had been replaced by a more shrewd officer. That person must have come from the core diplomatic agency of the empire. Wood only had to look at his clothes and habits to know the details at a glance. This person was called Peter, and he was extremely tactful. When he saw Wood, he immediately bowed his head deeply, revealing his shiny bald head, and respectfully asked, "Lord Archbishop, is it about the holy sword Oderfeis?" Wood glanced at him as if he wanted to see through this guy and then replied lightly, "This is a secret of the holy sanctum. If necessary, I will tell you." "I understand," Peter replied with a smile. Wood looked back. The fragment of the holy sword Oderfeis that Williams lost in the Battle of Ampere Seal was not important. The holy sanctum had also agreed to exchange a new frigate with Brando for the fragment of the holy sword. But the key was the will and soul of the holy sword. The identity of Count Tonagel was very special. He even had the shadow of the silver elves and the dragons behind him, which made the holy sanctum's higher-ups feel very troubled. What's more, the other party did not seem to have any intention of joining the empire, so the opinions of the higher-ups were not unified. On one hand, they believed that they should follow the choice of the Flame King, while on the other hand, their opinions were much stronger. This was another troublesome matter. Too many years of being high and mighty had made the holy sanctum of fire somewhat arrogant and even indifferent to things outside. Some of the elders even had thoughts of assassination. Not to mention how ridiculous it was to assassinate a noble under the rule of the holy sanctum of fire. What really made Wood angry was that these people seemed to have forgotten the teachings of the sages. Whether it was the empire or the truth, it would not have been a problem for the holy sanctum of fire 100 years ago. Since Cruz's reform, although the unity of the empire had strengthened day by day, the weight of the royal power had increased day by day, and it had begun to threaten the foundation of Cruz's existence. The funny thing was that some people had not realized this problem at all. Wood was still going to meet the representatives of the northern nobles who were still in the port of Ampere Seal today. Although the things under the table were getting more and more onerous, the war was still the top priority for the affairs left in Erewhon. The war against the Golden Mane Toquinen. Wood did not know if the eldest son of the king was fully prepared. Although he made a solemn vow when he made the promise, the Cipher family had already suffered a great loss in this war. What's more, as a puppet, it was still unknown how much prestige he could have. The Holy Sanctum would never invest much energy in a bet that was bound to fail. In this regard, Wood could only hope that the eldest son of the king would also understand this point. Fortunately, he was a smart guy and presumably would not be too naive. He walked out of the door with his deputy, but it was at this time that a servant came to him and bowed, saying, "Lord Archbishop, there are special visitors." Special visitors? Wood stopped. The bald Peter had already stepped forward and wanted to drive them away. Can't you see that the Lord Archbishop has something important to do? If there are any visitors, as long as they are not from the Empire, just let them wait a moment. Wood interrupted him and reached out to stop the guy. "Are they guests from the Empire?" Peter froze for a moment. "Yes," the servant replied deferentially. "Let them wait a moment, I'll be right there." Wood thought for a moment and replied with a frown. But before he could finish his words, a serious woman's voice rang out. "There's no need, Archbishop Wood. You know my habits. We are already here." Wood heard this voice and was slightly startled. He raised his head. Sure enough, he saw the woman with a prominent reputation in the Empire. She actually came. Unlike the sunny area of Ampere Seal, after crossing the vast Frata forest in the north and entering Petalsun, the weather in the countryside became rainy and rainy. The heavy rain in the past few days had caused the Maj River to surge, and the roads around Majeton had become muddy and difficult to walk on. In the torrential rain, a black ghost-like carriage jolted through the woods. A corner of the window curtain was lifted, and in the pitch-black carriage, an eye that was faintly white like a dead fish's eye stared motionlessly at the shadowy scenery outside the window. The gloomy clouds twisted into a ball over the forest like a shroud. Although it was only noon, the sky was dim. What is the commander of the Azure Skies doing in Ampere Seal? Declaring war on the Erewhon people? A hoarse voice asked, and then he sneered, as if he thought this joke was very funny. The sneer in the carriage was chilling. After a while, another voice said, I'm afraid it's for the war in the north. If that's what you think, you're not far from the gallows. The cruise people don't need to be distracted by a small Toquinen. They suffered a great loss in the Battle of Ampere Seal, and they don't want to give the Bugas any more leverage. The third person to speak had a calm, serious, and dignified voice. As soon as he spoke, the others fell silent. The Holy Cathedral of Fire lost both face and power in Ampere Seal. On the surface, they didn't gain anything from us, but in fact, the final winner was neither us nor them. The voice paused for a moment. Erewhon has a wise princess. Duke. Someone finally dared to speak up. Are you saying that we have attracted the attention of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Very likely. It's impossible that the cruise people didn't notice anything wrong. Do you really think you can do it flawlessly? The dignified voice replied. Then what should we do? No one answered. The carriage was silent for a moment, and only the creaking of the carriage could be heard. After a while, the hoarse voice said, as long as we find a way to delay. So that's why we're here. The dignified voice replied. At this time, the carriage finally stopped in the middle of its journey, and a dark green castle appeared in front of them in the rain. The soldiers on the battlements shouted, but it was difficult for their voices to pass through the rain. At this time, the door of the carriage finally opened, and a swordsman in a cloak jumped down. The swordsman looked up, and the unshaven face under the hood looked like a wreck or a wandering knight from the north, but if Brando was here, he would have recognized his name. The Eagle Swordsman Devard. Hurry up and open the city gates. This is your count's most distinguished guest, he shouted. Who are you? The soldiers on the battlements questioned. We are the allies he wants to see the most. Go tell him, if he doesn't want to be hanged by the princess, immediately open the gate and let us in. Devard replied arrogantly. This question and answer was extremely rude, but just as the soldiers were about to flare up, the Eagle Swordsman threw an item far away on the battlements. He watched as the item drew a beautiful parabola in the rain and fell into the city, then shouted, Take this to Count Radner, he will understand. Go, idiot. Oh. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 680. Brando, do you want me to ask the Roman too? No need, Freya. I'm used to it. Let her be, she knows what she's doing. By the way, help me keep an eye on her, and don't let her come crying to me with a red forehead. The background of this conversation was the verdant path of the Gras forest. A long line of carriages passed through the scattered spots of light. The knight in gold and red battle robes moved in an orderly manner, except for one. The merchant lady was wearing a shiny armor and holding the azure lance. She yelled and ran around the carriages without a care for her image. This was the second time she had done this week. Fortunately, the knight was already familiar with this cute countess. Anyway, as long as they stayed far away, at least they would not be knocked over. No matter how muddle-headed the merchant lady was, she would not hit the carriage, right? Freya looked back and could not help but sigh slightly. She originally thought that after she went to the Royal Knight Academy, Brando could at least restrain the Roman a little. But obviously it was just wishful thinking. At least until now, no one had succeeded in restraining this young lady. She looked at Brando and nodded to him. Then, she let down the curtain and rode her horse to Scarlet's side. The mercenary lady looked at the scenery around her with some familiarity. Unlike Freya, the south was as close to her as home. Scarlet. Miss Freya. Scarlet looked back and answered with some respect. Scarlet, I've told you many times, you can just call me Freya. I'm not a noble. Before I became a knight, I was just like you, from the countryside in the south. Freya frowned. Scarlet was a little embarrassed. Freya, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have given the azure lance to the Roman lady. I didn't expect her to be so. She suddenly felt a little rude, but she couldn't find a better adjective to describe the Roman's current state. Freya saw her embarrassment and comforted her. All right, she's not a rich girl. Forget it. She's just like that. She sighed weakly. When I was with her when I was young, I really admire myself for being able to live until now. But she's actually a very good Roman person. She's just a little childish. Scarlet looked over and couldn't help but deeply agree. However, when she turned her head back, her gaze couldn't help but fall in the direction of the carriage. Brando put down the curtains. After nearly a month of observation, he could basically confirm the state of the Holy Lance of Heaven. The firmament in Scarlet's hand was clearly not the complete form of the legendary Holy Spear that could strike down stars. There were multiple seals on the Holy Spear, and this was one of the possibilities that he had long thought of. What Brando didn't know was that Ovina had purposely placed these seals so that Scarlet could successfully control the firmament, or that someone had left these seals on the Holy Spear in the first place. But there was no doubt that even under the heavy seals, the Holy Lance of Heaven lived up to its name as a divine artifact. Its attack power was more than twice that of Halran Gaia, and its accompanying skills were even more terrifying. Most importantly, as a divine artifact, the firmament also had a special divine realm. The terrifying invincible fate was so powerful that even Brando had never seen it before. However, Brando did not reveal this secret. For one thing, he really couldn't find a good way to explain the fact that he could directly see the attributes of the equipment. In Wond, this was the job of high-level astrologers and alchemists, and they also had to go through many experiments before they could finally determine the purpose and usage of a magical equipment. On the other hand, for the current heroine, the weaker the azure lance the better, and the lower the profile of its existence the better. The merchant lady was messing around with the azure lance, and that was actually what he wanted. Anyway, everyone knew her temperament. If she took it out so blatantly, it would make people less suspicious that it was the real thing. Who would use the azure lance as a toy? Perhaps even William wouldn't dare to do so. However, Brando had been feeling a little uneasy recently. He had a faint suspicion that Ovina would kill him directly when she reappeared in the future. He turned his head anxiously and his gaze fell on the siblings opposite him. To be exact, it was the first in line to the throne of the kingdom of Erwin and his sister, the half-elf Princess Royal. It had been almost a month since the Holy Lance of Heaven recognized Scarlet as its master. The weather south of Ampere-Seal was in fact getting hotter by the day. Since the Battle of Ampere-Seal, every overt and covert activity carried out by the princess forces in the port had gone smoothly. However, the final destination of the Azure Lance was somewhat unexpected. The Bugas suddenly decided not to take the Azure Lance away. According to William's original words, they thought that this legendary holy relic might be more suitable to stay in Erewhon. However, Tanya also mentioned that the Bugas would probably send 1 or 2 wizards to the kingdom to study the power of the Azure Lance. Although he did not understand the Bugas' thoughts, these were afterthoughts for Brando. Time was tight, and he was unlikely to have new envoys from Ampere-Seal and other wizards arrive. After seeing William off, he left the port directly with the princess, passing by the Royal Knight Academy, and went straight to Tonajal. The princess was eager to see her best friend, Magadal, and he himself had to start preparing for the future of Erewhon. After a week of travel, the carriage finally approached the Glass River. Here for Brando it was basically the same as returning home. During this half a day, he had met several old members of the Red Bronze Dragon mercenary group, and Sue was finally able to meet her father, the Red Bronze Dragon Reto. It was the first time Brando saw the strong bar owner's daughter cry. The meeting between Carglass and his father was naturally a different scene. Since Brando was officially recognized, Sir Maxon was naturally exempted from the embarrassment of being imprisoned. However, this old-fashioned noble obviously did not necessarily agree with his precious son's approach, and scolded the first commander of the White Lion Legion under Brando. This naturally became the joke of the group of young people from Tonajal. But in any case, being able to return home was still a matter of excitement for everyone. However, no one would forget those heroic souls that would forever stay in Ampere-Seal. Brando silently thought about these trivial matters until the princess in front of him softly opened her mouth. The half-elf girl raised her head and looked at the young man opposite her. The mottled sunlight outside the curtains fell on her face, and that beautiful face of hers was divided into different shades of shadow. It was as if she was wearing a layer of natural veil, adding a sense of mystery out of nowhere. However, Princess Griffine's expression was very calm. She thought for a moment before quietly asking, Mr. Brando, the royal spies have news that Count Randner seems to have met with Erek, just as you guessed. In order to fight against us, they will form an alliance. Although Duke Anthony and the Highland Knight have agreed to send troops to fight, I'm still a little worried. Worried about what? I'm worried about Erek, Mr. Brando. My father is very familiar with him. The Erek family has been operating in the Highlands for generations under their rule, for the sake of overthrowing the kingdom. And today's Grand Duke Erek is undoubtedly the most cunning of all the heirs of their family. Her Royal Highness replied softly, Archbishop Wood told me that he has evidence to prove that Erek also colluded with All for One, but in the entire war, he only sent the eagle swordsman Devard to show his face at the end. As soon as the war ended, he hurriedly left Ampere Seal before the Holy Cathedral caught him, but he did not return to his own territory. Instead, he went to Magiton and formed an alliance with Count Randner. He never fights a battle that he is not sure of, so I suspect that he must have some conspiracy. Brando nodded. In fact, this was also something that bothered him. In fact, before the princess received the news, Wood had already sent a letter to tell Erek the cause and effect of the day of his escape, but he keenly felt that the Holy Cathedral seemed to have concealed some key information. The most important point was that Brando knew that a knight regiment from Cruz had secretly entered Erewhon, but he didn't know which regiment it belonged to. This knight regiment was obviously not here to deal with him, and naturally, it would not deal with the eldest son of the king in the north. So the remaining possibility could only be pointed to Erek. But what did Erek do to deserve such attention from the Holy Cathedral? Even if he colluded with the cultists, it was just a joke. To be honest, how many nobles in Erewhon did not collude with the cultists? Although Grand Duke Erek's direct collusion with All for One was a minority, the great nobles more or less raised some shady thieves. If the Holy Cathedral wanted to use this excuse to dodge, Brando really didn't even have the mood to listen. Erek must have some conspiracy, but the question was what the conspiracy was. Radner's primary target was definitely him and the princess, and a war between the two sides was inevitable. Although the Holy Cathedral of Fire was looking for trouble with Erek, it didn't necessarily mean that he and the princess would do the same. Cruz's people suffered a big loss in Ampere Seal, and they might take the opportunity to retaliate. And the core of the problem was that the situation in the north and south had stabilized, so the Holy Cathedral of Fire might not be happy to see the princess quickly unify the south. Besides, Erewhon's letter also mentioned that the upper echelons of the empire coveted the azure lance. Once it was confirmed that this holy relic was still in Erewhon, it could be a huge problem. This was the real problem. He thought about it and felt that the most important thing now was to get rid of the alliance between Erek and Radner. However, it was obviously not realistic to remove the power of the Erek family in the Erek Highlands in a short time. On the contrary, Count Radner himself was the weak link in this evil alliance. However, he and the princess alone were not enough. Oh, P.S. The warlord is here again. It's the third night watch again, you know. Finally, Nico-chan, I like you too. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 681. The sound of the brass doorknob turning seemed to pierce through the dark emptiness and solitude. Princess Graphine opened the wooden door with a creak and walked out of the room. Her silver curly hair set off her elf-like slender face. Her eyes were still a little red, but she had already regained her usual cold expression. Magadol, she has been sleeping all this time? Yes, it's no different from being dead. Although her basic physiological functions are still maintained, that's just on the surface. A self-conscious girl's voice answered before Brando could reply. Looking towards the direction of the voice, Princess Allah's curly hair shone like gold in the dark. She held a red wild fruit and took a bite. The juice flowed down the corner of her mouth and the curve of her chin. But the little female dragon did not care. Instead, she stared at Brando and Princess Graphine with her golden cat eyes. In fact, you can say that the one lying on the bed is just a shell that has lost its soul. According to the words of you humans, this description is very apartment. If she was a human, she would have died long ago. Her Royal Highness is asking me, Allahs. Brando replied with a straight face. Ever since this little female dragon came to his territory alone, she had been using his name and the deterrence of the dragon clan to eat and drink until today. The only praiseworthy thing she did was to check on Magadol's condition. But that was also driven by her curiosity. And it was obvious that even though she had been traveling in human society for a long time, she had not learned how to be tactful when talking to people. If she's asking me, I won't answer. What do you take me for, Brando? Alaz narrowed her eyes dangerously. But with the height of a 13-year-old girl, she was hardly intimidating. Stop arguing, it's nothing. The princess interrupted them. She did not want Brando to provoke the Dragon Clan because of her. She walked forward and asked quietly, My lord, about the alliance between Erek and Radner, do you have any thoughts? Alaz snorted coldly. Brando was startled. He thought that Princess Griffine would ask him about the nun princess, but she brought it up again. He had already thought about this problem on the carriage. The most suitable way to deal with Count Radner was to kill him. After all, things were different now. Unlike when he first came to Tonajul, Count Radner had overwhelming power. In terms of high-end combat power, even Duke Erek and Count Radner together might not be his match. Duke Erek had the Eagle Swordsman and Silver Knight, as well as a few famous swordsmen and some retainers, while Radner only had 7 or 8 gold-ranked lackeys. Even if Radner did not die in Ampere Seal, Brando could easily take care of them. After all, this was Wonde, and personal strength accounted for a considerable proportion of the war. In the history of Wonde, most of the higher-ups of the several legions were outstanding people, and there was no lack of outstanding people like his grandfather, Darius. The only problem was that the calculations in war were always mutual. If he schemed against the other party here, Duke Erek might beat him at his own game. The strength he showed in the Battle of Ampere Seal was already shocking. Although most people thought that Williams died under the gunfire of Erwin's first fleet, just the battle with Eagle Devard and the battle against the Titans was enough to make people pay attention to him, the rising star of Erwin. The name of Count Tonajul had long been spread throughout Erwin, and even among the higher-ups of Cruz, he was familiar with it. Whether it was in the tundra of the north or the countryside of the south, everyone knew that Erwin had another sword saint. He was even the descendant of Darius. Such news naturally could not escape Duke Erek's eyes and ears, not to mention that the old fox had personally experienced the war that day. Since he dared to show up in public despite knowing the disparity in strength, he was either too arrogant or he had other plans. Brando would rather believe that it was the latter. Therefore, it was best to prepare for a conventional war in addition to the strategy of beheading the leader. However, the territory of Erek was vast, and there were many mountains in Radner's territory. Without considering the participation of Cruz, it would take a lot of time to fight in both places. Count Radner had been at war with Duke Vero for many years, and maintained a large number of private soldiers in his territory. As for Duke Erek, he had been planning for a long time, and most of his subordinates were elite soldiers. On the other hand, other than the First Royal Fleet that was still resting in Ampere Seal, the princess could only rely on Frada's army and the Southern Legion. In addition, she also had the support promised by Duke Anthony and the Highland Knight. However, the Southern Legion had not received any supplies for a long time, and most of their structures were incomplete. Duke Anthony's army had also suffered heavy losses in the war in Ampere Seal, so the only ones that could participate in the war were Frada's nobles' army and the Highland Knights' reinforcements. In addition, Tonajul's pitiful little military strength. These miscellaneous troops together could not form an absolute advantage over Duke Erek and Count Radner's forces. Even if they did not consider Erek's schemes, it would probably be a long and arduous task to conquer Radner and Count Radner. The problem was that Brando was very clear that Erwin did not have the time to engage in such a long and drawn-out war. He could only look for other reinforcements. The best choice was naturally Duke Vero, who had a feud with Count Radner for generations. Princess Griffine silently listened to Brando's thoughts. When the sunlight from outside the courtyard shone on her face through the arched door, the half-elf girl stopped and turned around. I understand. The war with Count Radner will be handed over to you, Mr. Brando. Frada's army will also be under Tonajul's command. Brando suddenly froze. Your Highness. Of course he understood the meaning behind this sentence, but he did not seem to react for a moment. He subconsciously stopped and looked at the princess. The sun afternoon seemed to have just flooded the wild grape shelves in the courtyard, and the lush green color passed through the last section of the corridor before the arched door and imprinted on the princess' long dress. There seemed to be a moment of silence, and not a single sound could be heard. Princess Grafine looked at him, and there was only a very calm color in her silver eyes. There's no need to say any more. I believe in you, Mr. Brando. But Brando's mouth was a little dry. Although Princess Grafine had handed over the keystone to him that day in Ampere Seal, it was different from before. Now that Princess Grafine had handed over almost all of her forces to him, it seemed a little indulgent. This did not seem like the behavior of a clear-headed politician. However, Princess Grafine did not seem to want to give him a chance to speak. She lowered her eyelids, blinked her thick eyelashes slightly, and continued quietly. There's one more thing. Brendel heaved a sigh of relief. Fortunately, Elaz, the little female dragon, had already walked away in boredom. Otherwise, she would have laughed at him for making a fool of himself. Magadol, she is my dear friend. I understand she became like this because of me. No matter what, as long as there's a glimmer of hope, I hope you can save her. You're the only one by my side who has such an ability. So, can you promise me that? Brando did not look at the expression on Princess Grafine's face, but he could hear the rare weakness in her voice. He did not say much and only nodded. In fact, even if Princess Grafine did not mention it, he would have thought of a way to save Magadol. After fighting side by side, they were considered companions. This was what Senior Grafine had said. I understand, he replied. Princess Grafine raised her head, looked at him carefully, and then took 2 steps forward. She reached out a hand and pressed on his nobleman's scarf, and smiled with some relief. Thank you, my knight. You have never disappointed me. Then she stepped back, took one last look at him and walked down the stairs. In the blink of an eye, she disappeared from the courtyard, leaving Brando standing alone in a daze under the arched door. Princess Grafine seems to have a good impression of you, Brando. Until a crisp voice interrupted his thoughts. Brando's eyebrows twitched slightly. He turned around and saw a familiar face. Roman was wearing her thick merchant's clothes. She crossed her arms and stood a little behind him, curiously looking at the direction Grafine disappeared in. He didn't know when this guy had arrived. Brando looked at her face full of question marks, and could not help but ask a little unhappily. So you don't know how to be jealous at all? A little. Brando stared at her. Is my answer wrong, Brando? Roman looked at him and shrunk her neck. Brando sighed and reached out his hand. Give me your hand. Why, this is an order. Oh. Romaine thought for a moment and wiped her hand on her coat, and then put her hand in his palm. Brando felt the slightly cold temperature, and could not help but look at the young lady, and his heart softened. Have you been out on the streets? Not yet, Fella did not let me go out. If I knew this would happen, I would not have asked Scarlet to borrow that gun. It's too much, I already returned it to her. Roman was unhappy. I'll accompany you for a walk. Really? Romaine asked in surprise. Of course. Then. Brendel, can you really wake up that Princess Highness? It sounds like a night story, a prince and a princess. When she wakes up, will she marry you, Brando? This is not something you need to worry about. Brando replied unhappily. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 682. Once the war was put on the agenda, the preparations were like a wild horse that had escaped its reins and galloped forward. Tanajil had entered a state of readiness early on, and the White Lion infantry had begun to fill up the ranks. Ever since Medisha returned to her territory, the training of the wind archers had also been scheduled. Under the princess' instructions, the nobles that bordered Tanajil also began to expand their private armies. Most of these nobles were originally enemies of Abes. But ever since Count Ranner became the enemy of the kingdom, the number of people who wanted to curry favor with him increased day by day. Although Brando did not like these people, he did not reject them at the door. The moon of hazy summer passed by in a flash. Before the moon of scrolls arrived, the land was already filled with the scent of fire. The rising temperature burned the leaves of the trees, and the scorching sun licked the ground of the southern border day after day. Frada and the Southern Legion's army finally arrived. But before the last festival of summer, I still have to calm my citizens down from their nervousness. Before the last few weeks, He had ordered Abes to hold the Festival of Fire's championship as scheduled. This kind of competition corresponded with the Festival of the Winter Hunt. It was less formal, but because of the open availability of alcohol, it attracted the nobles and knights in the vicinity. The competition venue was set up outside Castle Abes, and the clamor of the competition had almost ignited the entire territory. However, for some quiet places they still maintained their relative independence. A thin wooden wall separated the sea of noise and the silence of the bar, and only the mercenaries' whistles would occasionally invade this relatively independent space. The hall was filled with the unique smell of cooked meat and spices. Although it was pungent, it gave a strong feeling of home. There were a few tables with unique names written on them such as Brendel, Romaine, Amandina, etc. They were reserved for the owner or his close friends. The signboard outside the hotel looked brand new. There was a three-masted ship on it, and the words Lord Romaine's smuggling anchorage were written on it. Such a vulgar name naturally belonged to someone. But the decorations in the bar were relatively warm. Scarlet sat at a wooden table in the southwest corner, and saw more and more people gathering outside. Most of them were youths of the White Lion Legion, local citizens and farmers. Ever since the refugees began to flood into Tanajul, the White Lion Legion had expanded beyond the 30 to 40 people that Carglass had when he first joined. Other than that, as more and more people settled in the territory, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen began to fill the countryside of Abes. At this moment, the championship of the summer festival was being held in the open space outside the bar. Now it was the turn of the archery competition. There were many beautiful tree elves on the field, and the crowd was unprecedentedly large. Scarlet turned around and saw a girl in silver armor placing a bouquet of daisies beside a wooden plate. She then put her hands together and closed her eyes to pray silently. Such a scene was reflected in Scarlet's eyes. She watched quietly and then asked, "Is her name Bess?" Freya opened her eyes, and there was sadness in her brown pupils. She nodded silently and said, "Bess loves crowds. This archery competition must be her favorite. To be able to compete with the legendary tree elves. Please don't be sad, Miss Freya. The living have to move on. In the past, the veterans often told us that death is just a nameless monument, and the living have to cross it and carry more things on their backs. That's why we have to be strong." Scarlet comforted her. "I'm sorry, I understand, but I can't help but think of the past, especially at times like this." The girl from Butchie blinked her eyes and sighed. "Sometimes I really want to go back to that time. How good would it be if there were no wars?" I can understand," Scarlet answered carefully. Scarlet looked at Freya and thought for a moment. Then she said, "It's because I've been through many battles since I was young. In every battle there would be a comrade dying. Some of them were newbies that I had just met, while others were close friends that I had spent a lot of time with. When I was still a child, I would cry loudly every time because of this, causing many people to laugh at me. But gradually, I became familiar with the parting of life and death." "How?" Freya was slightly stunned. She turned around and looked at the girl beside her in disbelief. Scarlet looked slightly younger than her, but her experience showed that she was much more mature. "I'm a mercenary. I work for money and survival. People like us will die in the next battle sooner or later. It's a natural ending for us. I've never been dissatisfied." Scarlet seemed to have recalled her past as well. She held the wooden cup in her hand and swirled the golden liquid inside, then quietly said, "But because of an accident, my lord changed me from this life, and let me know that there is another kind of life. I don't know if I should thank Sir Lord. I can more or less understand Sir Lord's thoughts and what he wants me to pursue. But, other than fighting, what else can I do? So compared to him, I'd rather be myself and not others. I can die with a clear conscience." "I'm sorry," Freya suddenly said. Scarlet was stunned. "I'm sorry, Scarlet. I never knew about your life. I think I'm too selfish to want to go back to the past. Brando is right. If we don't fight for it, no one can give us the peaceful life we want." Freya replied quietly. "Erwin is far from being able to covet comfort." The mercenary girl looked at her blankly. Some things that Freya had gradually begun to understand were still in a fog in front of her. At this time there was a burst of cheers outside the bar. The door of the bar was slammed open. Roman rushed in with a big basin and shouted, Medisha took first place again. The ale is sold out. Come and help. Be careful. Freya quickly reminded him. I know. Then there was a scream from the kitchen. Ah, my barbecue. Brando helplessly shook his head as he walked in, but he seemed to be in a good mood. He looked at Freya and Scarlet and smiled. Two beautiful ladies, don't you want to go out and celebrate with everyone? Our little princess took first place in archery. The future Valkyrie stared at him with wide eyes. Brando, what are you wearing? It's a military uniform. Erwin's cavalry uniform. How is it? Doesn't it look like it? Brando raised his hand that was holding the barbecue. There were a few obvious oil stains on the dark blue uniform. It was obvious that someone had wiped his hand on it. How can you wipe your hand on the uniform? The uniform represents the dignity of the kingdom. It's the greatest glory of a soldier. Brando, you're too much. Freya was so angry that she forgot about the previous sad incident. It was just convenient. Brando replied innocently. It was convenient. Ha, Freya, you go ahead. I'll go out and take a look. Brando saw that the future Valkyrie was about to lose her temper. Obviously, the things she learned in the Royal Knight Academy had made her feel a little too proud. He quickly laughed and prepared to leave. Stop right there, Brando. At this time, whoever stood still would be an idiot. Brando deeply understood this point. He originally came to show off the cavalry uniform to Freya and Scarlet, but he did not expect that the end result was a little out of his expectations. Fortunately, this small matter could not ruin his good mood at the moment. The cavalry uniform he was wearing came from AB's own cotton and dye workshop. Except for the cotton which was shipped through Ampere Seal, the uniform was almost entirely from Tonajal. This was once a barren land that produced almost nothing other than silver. The reason for the change was the increase in population. Due to the preparations made during the previous war, a large number of refugees were sent to Tonajal. The food reserves from Ampere Seal quickly converted the increased population into usable labor. 2 months ago, under Bosley's leadership, a cotton workshop, a dye workshop, a blacksmith workshop, a copper workshop, a clay and pottery workshop, and even a weapons and armor department were established. After half a year of careful management, Tonajal was no longer a barren land. On the contrary, it was gradually becoming self-sufficient to produce some necessary products. The first was food, weapons, and a small number of luxury goods. After the stormy season, business with the north gradually became more frequent. Sailboats with snow-white sails from Grey Harbor and Ampere Seal anchored at the newly built deepwater pier in Port Gris. Merchants with a keen sense of smell also began to discover the potential of this place. Ever since the month of the new moon, the number of merchants living in the port increased day by day. At the same time, there was also a large number of craftsmen. Just a few days ago, Brando met with a group of dwarven enchanters from the Black Mountains. These people were mostly refugees from the war. It was said that the war between the North and the Golden Mane Toquinen had begun to affect normal business. Under the pressure of the Holy Cathedral, the king's eldest son had no choice but to go to war with the Lion Beastmen. This was a good opportunity for the South to develop and strengthen. As far as the eye could see, the carriages carrying goods were passing through the main road near Ferber Castle. The fields at the border of the forest were no longer barren, and there were farmers working everywhere. A year ago, or even half a year ago, this would have been a scene that would have been impossible to see in Tonajal. And all of this was brought about by the combined efforts of him and everyone else. He raised his head and looked at the tall riders in the distance, holding high the winner's pennant and galloping around the crowd. The silver flag with the lily embroidered on it fluttered in the wind. 1,000 years ago it fluttered like this, and 1,000 years later it fluttered above the earth once more. The crowd burst into thunderous cheers. Brendel saw the silver elf princess being lifted up high by the tree elves. She was also looking at the flag from afar, and there seemed to be something shining in her eyes. Medisha! Medisha! The citizens shouted as they raised their wine glasses high in the air. The straw huts from Grodin's era could no longer be seen on both sides of the streets. With the help of the Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries and Odom's workers, they had built a flat street along Castle Abes. There were neat wooden huts on both sides of the street. The adults and children standing by the huts all had satisfied smiles on their faces. When he passed by the street, someone recognized him, and a large group of people bowed to him sincerely. Brando also returned the greeting. In truth, he was already used to such a life, and no longer felt uneasy when people bowed to him. The knowledge that came from the modern era was slowly fading away. But in the depths of his soul, the pride of an advanced civilization still supported his every word and action. At least, he did not think that this respect and pride was innate. He placed a copper coin in the hands of a little girl beside him. This copper coin represented the blessing from the Lord before midsummer. The little girl was so excited that her face turned red. She held the coin with both hands and ran to the side of a woman. Perhaps it was her mother. The woman took the coin from the little girl's hands and bowed to him. "My lord! My lord!" The shouts quickly changed to a different kind of voice. The people of Abes were expressing their respect for their new lord from the bottom of their hearts. Brando narrowed his eyes. He knew that this feeling of satisfaction was illusory and temporary. Even earlier, the people were still anxiously asking about the upcoming war. In this turbulent era, everyone was trying their best to protect the temporary stability around them. There was nothing wrong with this, but Erwin was far from being safe. Some people were bound to bleed and even give up their lives to protect others. But at least he wanted to protect Erwin. He walked through the crowd and walked to the side of Her Royal Highness. Griffine was silently watching all of this. The female knight was next to her, one hand on her sword. But Brendel could feel that Maynard was looking at him. In fact, the feeling Maynard gave him was far less intense than when he was an Ampere seal, which made every nerve in his body tense up. Under such an atmosphere, how could anyone be nervous? "They like you very much, Mr. Brando. If there is anyone in Erwin who can be called the model of the ancient nobles, then I can definitely find such qualities in you." Princess Griffine's eyes sparkled as she said with slight emotion, "This is the dream of Her Royal Highness. The whole of Erwin, everyone can no longer be trapped by poverty, war, and disaster. The tragedy of Bucci will not happen again." Brando replied. Princess Griffine blinked. "Mr. Brando, I understand that this is a little too ideal, but I at least hope to change the kingdom's current situation. Oh, in the north, even in Ranner, Viro, and many other places, the war and disasters caused by the nobles themselves are still ongoing, and the descendants of King Eric have done nothing. Yes, so Tanajul will not be peaceful for long. Everyone must fight and sacrifice for their own future. Is Mr. Brando ready? We only need to convince Duke Viro." Medisha was tossed around by the enthusiastic elven girls for a while before being put down. The silver elf princess probably had never experienced such a scene in her life, and her clothes were messed up. Her little face was so red that it was almost dripping blood. The moment she landed on the ground, the tree elves whistled and scattered, probably because they were afraid of retaliation. The winner of our archery competition almost fell to the ground on her butt. Fortunately, Amandina was quick and hurriedly supported her. "Those damned girls." Amandina shook her head and handed over Medisha's silver bow. "Thank you, Sister Amandina," Medisha said with lingering fear. But when she raised her head and looked at the flag that belonged to the silver elf royal family flying high in the distance, her eyes shone with satisfaction. She did not know how many years it had been since this flag appeared in front of people's eyes so brilliantly. The moment she held the bow, her body and mind seemed to have returned to a time in the past. In the wilderness, silver war horses galloped, and the horn sounded for a long time, as if resonating with the vast earth. Amandina saw that the silver elf princess was a little absent-minded for a moment, and guessed in her heart what she was thinking. She sighed and gently put a cloak on her. Although it was the middle of summer, it was easy to fall sick after sweating and the cold wind blowing. She had long been used to doing these things for Brando, and for a moment she forgot that Medisha was just a heroic spirit. Medisha was slightly startled, and looked at Amandina with some gratitude. "Thank you very much, Sister Amandina. This is the second time." Amandina shook her head, not taking it seriously. "No, because I thought of my sister." Medisha replied seriously. "Is that so? Well, it's probably more gentle. Just like how I imagine my sister. Yes, that's it." The silver elf princess smiled sweetly. Amandina looked at Medisa carefully. She had heard some of Medisa's stories and knew that her relationship with her sister was not as harmonious as it seemed. She reached out and smoothed the hair in front of the girl's forehead and replied, "Probably between the royal family it's like this." "Royal family?" Medisha thought for a moment and looked at Amandina. "By the way, Sister Amandina, has the Lord still not found the reason?" "Yes." Amandina also thought of this matter and couldn't help but shake her head. "Miss Allah's also checked for me, but I'm not of the Golden Folk bloodline. That time, it was probably the blessing of Lady Martha." "The blessing of Lady Martha?" Medisha looked at Amandina and suddenly asked, "Sister Amandina, where's your necklace?" "Necklace?" Amandina was slightly startled, and subconsciously pressed on her chest. "Necklace?" "Yes, the necklace that I've been wearing before. Before going to Ampere Seal, didn't I always have it with me? I remember seeing it once in the Shining Sea." Medisha replied softly. "That? I lost it before, what's wrong?" "It's nothing." The Silver Fairy Princess smiled slightly. "I didn't expect the meticulous Sister Amandina to lose something. If I tell the Lord, he definitely won't believe me." "No need," Amandina hurriedly replied. "The Lord is busy preparing for the war with Count Randner. It's better not to disturb him with these trivial matters." "Is that so?" Amandina nodded slightly. Medisha thought for a moment, as if she wanted to say something else. But it was at this moment that a commotion suddenly came from a corner of the arena. The crowd over there seemed to be a commotion, and the attention of the two was attracted for a moment. But compared to Medisha, Amandina was after all just an ordinary person. The Silver Fairy Princess quickly discerned what was happening over there. "Huh," she said softly. "What's wrong?" Amandina looked in that direction in vain as she turned back and asked. "Some strange guys have come," Medisha murmured. "Oh." For Tosancade Forest, the rainy weather that had lasted for many days seemed to have begun to patronize Magitan and the nearby areas after a short period of sunny weather. For the residents of the Misty Forest, it seemed that there were not many good days since Dukarek's visit. The gloomy sky that brought the rain always hovered above their heads, although the beginning of the rainy season in the Tosancade region was 4 or 5 months. But this year it was a little too ridiculous. The wooden fence gate creaked and swayed in the torrential rain as it was lifted up. In the curtain of rain, a pair of cold eyes silently watched the rain slide down the fence gate, falling from the tip like a pillar with a broken string, and then mixed into the muddy water. 2 attendants held up a cloak for Count Randner to block the continuous rain. The Count, who had the privilege of the kingdom, silently watched the carriage on the drawbridge drive out of the outer city under the guidance of the guards. Then he turned back and quickly disappeared above the city walls. Dukarek held up the curtain of the carriage with one hand, withdrew his gaze from that direction, and sneered softly. The carriage fell into darkness again. "This old fox is really careful and greedy. Indecisiveness and stubbornness are his biggest weaknesses." "I'm afraid this is a typical weakness of the nobles, Your Grace," a woman's voice replied. "But at least we managed to convince this guy, so this trip was not in vain. He will regret it." The hoarse voice laughed coldly. "It's just that he doesn't have a choice, but he might not be sincere about joining us. Come to think of it, how could such a mediocre noble understand such profound principles?" Dukarek shook his head. "But Duke Cohen, this guy is indeed not trustworthy. You better make plans." He reminded again. "We're already prepared," the hoarse voice replied gloomily. "He's just a scapegoat." Erek nodded and looked in that direction with an inexplicable gaze. The towering walls of Magitan had long become a faint shadow in the curtain of rain. Then he put down the curtain, and the carriage returned to darkness again. In a direction that he could not see, Count Randner was accompanied by a knight as he walked down the spiral staircase of the castle. The dim light in the corridor shone on his face. The once arrogant Count of the kingdom was now filled with cold doubts. "Father, do you really intend to form an alliance with those things?" A figure was already waiting below. The noble youth looked up and asked impatiently. "Once we agree, we will have no way out." Count Randner looked at his second son. "Do we have a way out now? It seems like you still don't understand your situation." "No, I mean, enough." Count Randner interrupted him impatiently. "I know what you want to say, and of course I will make preparations. Madara. At least Madara's side." He sighed. "Forget it, you go and contact Cruz's people." "Cruz's people?" There are always some things that they need to know. The Count was silent for a moment and replied faintly. P.S. The third day. I went out to do something today, so I'm much later. Sob, so be it. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 683. In Medisha's line of sight, a group of strangely dressed knights had already caught her attention. The knights stopped by the side of the road and all stopped to watch on their horses. They had different expressions on their faces, but most of them were a little curious. In the countryside of Tanajul, apart from the White Lion Guards and Brando's subordinates, it was rare to see such a knight in bright armor. However, even the White Lion Guards would not embellish their breastplates with a flame emblem. Moreover, their armor was not made in the style of Aween's locals. On the contrary, the armor on their bodies was dark red in color, and was decorated with more fur and keratin elements. This was the typical style of armor of the people of Cruz. The color of the armor was also due to the fact that the local steel produced in Cruz was mixed with more fire elements. Some strange visitors have come. Medisha pondered for a moment and understood the other party's identity. But why would Cruz's envoys appear in Tanajul at this time of year? Lorena put down the iron handguard that blocked the sun and looked at the windmill and large tracts of farmland in the distance. But her gaze swept over the lax defense of Abi's castle, and a slight look of contempt appeared on her face. Castle Abi's had lacked repair since Grodin's time, and Brando only used it as a temporary residence with no intention of repainting it. So the female knight from Cruz could easily see the holes in the dilapidated castle. I didn't expect there to be such a place in the countryside of Erewhon the further south we go. In comparison, we've been to some places in the north of the kingdom, and the current scene is far less prosperous than here. Isn't it said that there's only a barren wilderness left in the south of Yusong? She muttered to herself, but her attention was attracted by the championship tournament that was being held nearby. The crowd outside Abi's castle made her turn her head and carefully observe the knight who was on the field. The records you've seen are from a few years ago. It's not surprising that there might be some changes, a female voice replied. Lorena did not have to turn her head to know whose voice it was. No doubt it was a very distinctive voice, for it was impressionable in every way. The unhurried tone was quiet and elegant and unforgettable. It was as if the owner of the voice had already thought it through before saying such words. If Brando were here, he would definitely recognize the owner of the voice. The lady who was protected in the middle by many Kurlutz knights looked like she was only 18 or 19 years old, but she had a kind of mystery and sexiness that did not match her age. She was the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Kurlutz Empire, Delphine, whom he had met once in the Black Forest. The Prime Minister's daughter quietly observed everything here. Her long black hair hung down like silk, and her eyes seemed to contain a natural mystery, giving people an unfathomable quiet aura. She obviously attracted the most attention on horseback. After all, such beauty was rare even in the most prosperous areas of Erewhon and Cruz, let alone in Tanajul. So much so that the local people couldn't help but take a few more glances at her. Their curiosity stemmed from the fact that there was a woman in the world more beautiful than the Lord's fiancée and Her Royal Highness the Princess. However, Delphian was wearing the robe of a Cruz noble civil official, more like a diplomatic envoy. Her robe was dyed dark purple, rather than the gold or red commonly seen in areas where people believed in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. This outfit further explained her identity. Miss Delphian, do you know anything? Lorena turned and asked. Delphian nodded. As far as I know, the Count only became the lord of this place not long ago, so the changes here are likely to be related to him. She answered calmly, only pausing slightly when she mentioned Brando. Lorena glanced at the Prime Minister's daughter, and thought for a moment without saying anything. She knew that the man Delphian liked in the Black Forest had died indirectly because of the lord they were about to meet. She took the initiative to go this time, probably not just to deliver a letter. The female knight changed the subject and pretended to ask, "It's him? I didn't expect the lord to have such outstanding political talent. I heard he's still very young, isn't he?" "Yes, very young. I've met the Count once before," Delphian said lightly, "but to say that he's talented in politics is an exaggeration. The Count has control of Tanajul's silver mines, and I heard that he has recently excavated a crystal mine. Everything at present is just a temporary illusion built by piling up wealth. Think so too. This is just a third-rate competition. But it's okay, at least it's quite lively. The young knight sitting behind Lorena yawned and even looked at the scene in front of him disinterestedly. However, he forced himself to perk up. But it seems like we're quite lucky to have bumped into these country bumpkins celebration. Maybe the local lord will be tactful enough to treat us to a sumptuous banquet. Ever since we left Ampere Seal, the taste in my mouth has almost become a companion of weeds. What weeds? Those are wild vegetables. Lorena glared at the guy. If it were any other knight in the team, naturally they wouldn't dare to be so presumptuous in front of her, the knight captain. But the man in front of her was His Majesty the Emperor's younger brother, the eldest son of Prince Burano and her fiancé. Originally, he wasn't on the list for this operation, but this guy still followed them all the way on the pretext of protecting her. Martha above, God knew she didn't need this guy's protection at all. As an official knight captain of the Azure Skies Legion, she was more than capable of fighting two of this guy. But Lorena sighed in the end. As a political marriage, she didn't have much of a good impression of the other party, but she didn't have much of a bad impression either. Although this guy's nature was a bit nasty compared to some of the nobles in the capital, he was still barely acceptable. The young knight shrugged. Well, you have the final say. He looked around and said, but I don't know if there will be a legendary bonfire party tonight. Think about it. Maybe there will be a passionate mountain girl who will take a fancy to me. I'm really looking forward to it. He turned his head and raised his voice. Don't you think so, Lorena? The female knight replied coldly. Enough, Philas, don't cause trouble. No one here cares whose heir you are. You'd better know who the lord here is. Her tone was unfriendly, and it was obvious that this guy had caused her a lot of trouble along the way. But Lorena also knew that her words might not have any binding force on the other party. Fortunately, this was only Erewhon, not Cruz. In such a small kingdom, the local lords would at most express their dissatisfaction verbally. Of course I know. That count is famous in Ampere Seal this time and made us suffer a big loss. Didn't the Duke of Flowerleaf and the Grand Duke of Noshk both say that we Cruz people haven't lost so much face in the last 100 years? The Cruz people will naturally remember such a great kindness. Philas was talking nonsense when he suddenly saw Lorena staring at him coldly. He quickly shuddered. Well, I understand. For Lady Veronica's sake, I won't trouble him. Although I also promised that little girl Vahina. Okay, I understand. I'll listen to you, dear Miss Lorena. Philas, if it weren't for your father's sake, I really wouldn't want to marry you. The female knight replied coldly. I know. I won't say it anymore, okay? The young knight hurriedly calmed his fiancée's anger. At least he knew that it was his honor to marry the genius of the capital and the daughter of the duke. The female knight thought that the source of trouble in the group had finally calmed down for a while, and she turned back to find the local lord. But she didn't expect to hear a long whistle behind her before she could breathe a sigh of relief. Lorena, look over there. Philas whistled and suddenly shouted excitedly. Usually, when this young master was in high spirits, nothing good would happen. Sure enough, when Lorena turned back, she saw, but Lorena had just turned back, and before she could breathe a sigh of relief, she immediately heard Philas whistle a long whistle. A large group of people was coming down the road, clustered around a little girl. But she had to admire her fiancé's taste, because it was indeed a rare beauty. The girl was no more than 16 or 17 years old, and like many girls in the countryside, she had her hair pulled up to show a forehead as smooth as jade for ease of work. But she was wearing a thick, traveler's leather outfit, which was very common in the southern part of Erewhon. Standing in the crowd, she looked very unique and eye-catching. Philas, don't mess with others. Lorena knew that her fiancé actually cared a lot about her, but his active nature made this guy always unable to resist flirting, but only verbally. This guy had suffered a lot at the hands of some rich young lady, but he didn't look like he was going to learn his lesson. Her words obviously didn't have any effect, because Philas was completely energized. He whistled as loud as he could. Since leaving the Empire and passing through so many areas, he had never seen such an outstanding girl somewhere. Except, of course, his own fiancée and the daughter of the Empire's prime minister, whom he couldn't touch. We, the young prince's son from the Cruz Empire, naturally saw the Roman. After the merchant lady managed to save a few pieces of roast meat from the kitchen, she ran out and found that Brando was nowhere to be seen, so she simply continued to peddle ale alone along the street. Since she was out in the open all year round, almost all the people of Abes knew the fiancé of their very kind lord. But no one dared to take advantage of her, and instead bought the ale from her with a smile. It was also an honor to be able to drink ale sold by the lord's wife herself. But the Roman was holding an empty basin in one hand and the banner of the silver fairy princess, which she had swindled out of God knows where, talking happily with the people around her, apparently oblivious to the cruise nights on this side. Of course she couldn't be blamed. After all, in this lively season, there were horsemen and guards in festive costumes everywhere. For the average citizen, not many people could tell the difference between the armor of the Kurlutz people and Aween's own standard armor. For our merchant lady, of course, it was even harder to tell. Anyway, they were all dressed like tin cans, and they didn't have the pointed ears of elves, so they all looked the same, didn't they? Besides, who would have thought that a cruise night would appear in such a remote place? It wasn't until a shadow appeared in front of her, as if blocking the sun, that the Roman looked up slightly and saw the tall cruise knight in front of her. Philas urged his horse in front of the Roman, and with one hand on the reins, he turned the horse around. Because this move was played so beautifully, a few knights from other areas around them cheered, and Philas himself was very satisfied. In his impression, this move was more than enough to intimidate a few Erewhon country bumpkins. "Beautiful lady, may I have the honor of knowing your name?" He looked up, wanting to see the look of worship he imagined. He had often played this trick in the alfalfa wilderness, and along the way, so he was already familiar with it, and every time he did it, he would win a lot of cheers and eyeballs. But this time, Philas found that he was destined to be disappointed, because he narrowed his eyes and found that the Erewhon country bumpkins in front of him were not looking at him with worship, but rather, they were looking at him as if he was an idiot. That look seemed to say, "Where did this country bumpkin come from?" To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 684. The young knight could not help but widen his eyes, almost suspecting that he was hallucinating. He had seen peasants and travelers in many parts of the country, and even some of the bolder merchants, but none of them did not tremble in the presence of a nobleman such as himself, and had never seen such an insolent look on his face. In fact, Roman's mouth was also agape as she stared at this guy in a daze. Because the merchant lady's reaction was a beat slower than the others, she was still trying to think, and had no idea how the person in front of her appeared. If it were not for her basic common sense, she would have thought that the other party had fallen from the sky. It had to be said that after such a ridiculous idea ran through her mind, she asked seriously, "Who are you? Are you looking for Brando?" "Brando?" Philas finally reacted, but unfortunately, as a noble, he had obviously only heard of the title of Count of Tonagel, and had never heard of the existence of Brando. He thought for a moment, and felt that the country girl in front of him was probably scared silly by him, so he changed to a gentle smile and continued, "No, I'm here for you, beautiful lady. My name is Philas, the future heir of the Barano family." Roman thought for a moment. "You know me?" "No." Philas heard his fiancée giggle behind him, and could not help but feel a little annoyed. He had been successful since he left the Empire, but today he seemed to have hit a snag. "This should be the first time we've met, beautiful lady." "Ah, I see." The merchant lady seemed to have finally reacted. "You want to buy my wine, right? You know your stuff. Roman has the best ale in all of Tonagel, no all of Erewhon." For the first time, she realized that the tall knight in front of her might be a potential customer, so she began to introduce him without stopping. No, stop. Although Philas finally knew the name of the girl in front of him, he could not help but say hurriedly, "I don't want to buy your ale." "You're not buying wine?" "I'm not buying." Roman narrowed her eyes slightly. She finally understood that the other party wasn't trying to bargain with her. Thus, she thought for a moment and decided to show the ruthless side of a merchant. She didn't even say a word and directly walked around this guy. Faraz immediately heard a roar of laughter. Not only the country bumpkins, but even the cruise knight and Lorena behind him couldn't help but laugh. Our young knight could not hold on any longer. He instinctively reached out to grab the Roman flag. "I say, wait a minute. Unfortunately, before he could touch the flagpole in his opponent's hand, a silver light suddenly shot out from the crowd. Philas was still an official knight, and he reacted in the nick of time, immediately pulling out the longsword at his waist in an instant. With a crisp sound, the two shining swords clashed together. The huge force caused Philas' body to lean back slightly, and then he realized that the person who blocked his sword was an equally outstanding female knight. Freya was wearing a silver white lion armor, and holding the Lionheart sword high in her hand. She looked coldly at the cruise knight on horseback. She did not move, but firmly blocked Philas' attack with one hand on the ground. Upper silver level. Philas stared at the female knight in front of him and could not help but be slightly surprised. With just one exchange of blows, he estimated that the other party's strength was about the same as his, but it seemed that the other party was much younger than him. Freya was now only in her early 20s, but he knew very well that he had probably been practicing swordsmanship for more than 20 years. There was such a genius in this remote countryside. Philas frowned slightly and estimated that the other party's talent might be similar to his fiancée's. Of course, he did not know that Freya's strength had advanced by leaps and bounds after the Battle of Ampere Seal. Before going to the port city, the progress of her strength was probably far inferior to his. But combined with the previous rumors, it was enough to make him frown. He knew that the local lord was a famous genius among Erwin's people, but he did not expect that the other party also had such a capable subordinate. Philas was frivolous, but he was not a fool. "Who are you? Who are you?" Philas and Freya asked at the same time. "We are a delegation of Cruz's people." At this moment, a voice came from behind and ordered, "Philas, surrender her sword." Philas was stunned and turned his head, only to find that the person who gave the order was the Prime Minister's daughter, Delphian. He saw the woman looking coldly at him and ordered mercilessly, "Philas, now you represent the face of the Empire. If she dares to resist, kill her." "Miss Delphian?" Lorena, of course, heard Delphian's order clearly. She was shocked. She had thought that Delphian would come to trouble the Lord, but she did not expect the other party to be so decisive and kill as soon as she opened her mouth. Of course, whether to kill or not was not her concern. The point was, if it was Philas who did it, she knew very well that her fiancé would definitely get into big trouble here. But unexpectedly, Delphian seemed to have made up her mind. She looked coldly at the female knight and said, "Lorena, you should know that the dignity of the Empire is not to be blasphemed. Showing your sword to an envoy of the Empire for no reason is tantamount to a declaration of war." But she didn't do it on purpose. "We can ask the local lord to apologize for it." Lorena was also panicking. She never dreamed that Delphian would just throw such a big hat at her. "No need. No need." Before the female knight finished speaking, Delphian and Freya replied in unison. Freya separated the Roman with one hand and stared coldly at these people. "If it weren't for you Cruz people, Beth wouldn't have died. But you have never learned from the tragedies of others, and I will never apologize to people like you. Maybe you think you're born to be better than others, but one day you'll understand the price of making the right and wrong choices." Erwin's future Valkyrie scolded angrily. The Valkyrie emblem on her forehead suddenly became dazzling. A pair of wings of light spread out from her back in an instant, and a bright white flame burned from the palm of her right hand, turning the Lionheart sword in her hand into a sword burning with holy flames. "Ah!" Lorena had wanted to dissuade Delphian, but suddenly felt the female knight in front of Philas's aura skyrocketing. In an instant, she broke through the limits between the upper silver and the peak silver, and was even faintly approaching the realm of gold. Another 20-year-old gold rank existence. Her expression changed and she immediately warned, "Philas, be careful." But it was still a little too late. Freya, who was completely enraged by the Prime Minister's daughter, slashed her sword upwards. The terrifying power was so terrifying that Philas could not resist at all, and he was directly swept off the back of his horse. Then the Valkyrie took a step forward, and the wings of light behind her flapped gently. She was already off the ground, and as if flying, she flew straight towards Delphian. "Oh my God, Seraph!" Cruz's knight couldn't help but exclaim. However, their exclamations apparently didn't attract the attention of the onlookers around them. The people probably didn't expect the two sides to fight just like that, and immediately scattered in an uproar. Some people fled in the direction of the arena, while the more rational ones went straight in the direction of the Lord. Damn it, Philas. Lorena saw her fiancé being sent flying and finally couldn't care less. She immediately unsheathed her long sword and faced Freya head-on. As soon as she made her move, the faces of the knight from all over Tanajul, who was rushing over from the arena in the distance, immediately changed. If Freya was only close to the gold rank, then the terrifying aura of the female knight was the true pinnacle of the gold rank. Delphian, who was behind all the crew's knight, couldn't help but sneer when she saw this scene. Philas didn't recognize the Roman and Freya, but it didn't mean that she knew nothing about the Count of Tanajul. Now Freya couldn't help but make a move, but how much chance did the other party have of surviving in front of the #1 genius girl of the city of Rusta? She probably already had the answer in her heart. Even in Kurlutz, only a few people knew about this secret. The seemingly docile female knight in front of him was, in fact, the next successor of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to the Grand Commander of the Holy Knights. The reason was actually very simple. Lorena was the only person in crews who could learn the entire set of flash strike sword technique in 400 years. Freya quickly realized this as well. Although she said that she wanted to teach these crews people a lesson, it didn't mean that the future Valkyrie of Erewhon had completely lost her mind. Her first target was actually Delphian, who was protected by the crew's knight, after she sent Philas flying in front of her. Freya, of course, had already seen that it was the inhumanly beautiful woman who was behind the scenes instigating the relationship between the Erewhon people and the crew's people. Although she didn't understand why the other party was doing this, subduing the other party first was undoubtedly the most direct way. But she was right about one thing, but she didn't expect the development after that. As soon as she drew her sword, she only saw the female knight, whom she hadn't paid much attention to before, flash slightly on horseback, and then a sharp sword appeared in front of her. Flash strike sword technique. Because Brando was also good at the same swordsmanship, Freya had of course seen this swordsmanship before, and even experienced it herself. But in her memory, Brando's flash strike sword technique was far less stunning than the one she was seeing now. The sharp blade appeared in front of her forehead without any warning, and it looked as if she had bumped into it herself instead of the other party stabbing at her. Freya was shocked and hurriedly raised her head to try to avoid the sword, but it was still a little too late, and the blade directly drew a line of blood on her forehead. The Valkyrie gritted her teeth, and the stinging pain on her forehead almost made her see black, but fortunately, it wasn't a fatal wound. She desperately flapped her wings of light and turned around in midair, but before she could breathe a sigh of relief, scarlet blood gushed out of her arms, shoulders, and lower abdomen at the same time. Freya screamed, and she couldn't believe how she had been hit. It felt as if Lorena's sword had appeared in countless directions of attack at the same time. So this was the real flash strike sword technique. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 685. Freya's eyes widened as she fell from midair. She watched as the female knight swung her sword at her again, but she was too seriously injured to dodge. She couldn't help but close her eyes, her heart cold. But an exclamation replaced the tragic scene that should have happened, which everyone couldn't bear to watch. In front of everyone's eyes, an azure spear firmly blocked the long sword in Lorena's hand with a clang. The female knight immediately realized that the other party had companions as reinforcements and subconsciously wanted to withdraw her sword and retreat, but the next moment, she was surprised to find that she couldn't move. How could this be? Lorena was shocked. Ever since she learned the flash strike sword art, she had never encountered such a thing. She found that she wasn't unable to move because of some magic, but she felt that the space in front of her, which was originally under her control, suddenly became obscure, and the blade that moved freely in it seemed to have fallen into a layer of condensed ice. She raised her head in horror and looked at the girl with the ponytail standing in front of her. Scarlet didn't say a word and stared at her coldly with the azure spear in her hand. Another girl at the peak of gold. Although Lorena had long known of Brando's strength, she never dreamed that a mere Tanajul would hide so many geniuses. As if all the monsters of Erewhon were gathered here. And it was at this moment that a cold voice came. The flash strike sword art uses spatial movement to directly cause damage, so under the invincible fate, even the spatial movement effect is left with less than 10% of the effect. It's true that everything has its nemesis. Hearing this voice, Delphian, who was standing behind all the night, suddenly changed her expression. Count Tanajil. The woman seemed to be gnashing her teeth as she said the name. She subconsciously wanted to retreat, but the voice shouted first. The county. As soon as the voice fell, an invisible shackle fell from the sky and fell on every cruise person present. Then a somewhat cold voice reached the ears of these knights. Don't worry. Spatial laws freeze. Brando's figure had actually emerged from the crowd. He parted the crowd and caught Freya, who was falling from the air. He raised his head and stared coldly at the daughter of the Prime Minister of Cruz. Madam, I believe we've met once in the loop of trade winds? Did Veronica send you here to tell me that Cruz is ready to declare war on Erewhon? If that's the case, I'll accompany you at any time. Brando's words caused an uproar. The holy palace of Aladnor was shrouded in a cloud of mist all year round. The empty floor of the obsidian hall reflected a dim blue light, as dark as a mirror. In the darkness, the pillars of the dead, which were stacked with 120 white bones, supported the Gothic dome formed by layers of bones. Here it was said that the breath of a living person would be instantly frozen into ice crystals that resembled glass shards. Therefore, the hall was always chilled to the bone, and the hungry wail that passed through the pillars was like the ravings of a lunatic lingering above the vault. The residents of the Silent Bay believed that the hunger wail was the scream of the ghouls that crawled out from the abyss. The people of Wonde often believed that the breath of the dead would form wind, so it lingered in the air. But in fact, such a natural landscape had already existed here long before the founding of Madara. Note: the bay between the north of Erewhon and Saint-Tossel today. In the faint whistling of the wind, the Black Knight in black robes passed through the pillars, the metal hook-shaped ornaments at the end of their cloaks clanking as they were dragged along. These dark courtiers passed by the huge broodmother of the spirit realm crouching on both sides of the pillars of the dead. Under the gaze of their 4 pairs of lantern-like eyes, they stood in 2 rows in the center of the hall without saying a word. They were as silent as one. Insursta the dragon stood at the end of the hall, side by side with Tarkus, watching the scene with interest. Unlike most of the old-fashioned, decaying undead that seemed to have burned out like their lives, Insursta had a wide range of knowledge. He knew the scenery of the ancient kingdom opposite the Black Bramante Rose, the splendid culture of the Cruz people, and even most of the mortal literature in the area of Erewhon and Cruz often recorded that the Black Knight was an undead creature in armor. In fact, contrary to most of the rumors circulating, the Black Knight of Hull was a very special kind of undead even in Madara. Most of their territories were near the inland sea of the Dead Moon, and they maintained the cold and elegant habits of life. When the dead were alive, the oath was engraved on the armor, and the soul fire lingered around the obsession of the living, driven by the fire of revenge. This was the origin of the Black Knight. Their stubbornness was famous even in Madara. Although people often said that they were as stubborn as the rotten bones of Madara, the Black Knight was especially stubborn. The living knight adhered to dogma, but these dead knights were forever trapped by oaths and curses. Insursta the dragon thought that they could be called the Madara of Madara, for the time being. He looked at the scene with a playful face, which was incompatible with the stern-faced Tarkus beside him. A buzzing voice sounded in the hall. In the name of the moon of eternal darkness and the black flower, the supreme king of the kingdom of darkness, the wielder of Loki's staff, please accept the allegiance and tribute of the lords from the east. The voice seemed to stretch the empty hall further, and it spread to the other end of the hall, but there was no response for a long time. Above the hall, the Supreme One on the throne waited for a moment before softly grunting. The Black Knight bowed their heads. Cheers for His Majesty's majesty. After even the territory of the Sea of the Dead Moon has surrendered, the unification of the Kingdom of Darkness after 1,000 years is almost at hand. Other than that woman Yalvit, who still has no idea what she's thinking, there's only the land of spiders left. Tarkus, the Dead Moon is rising. It's really exciting to be able to participate in this kind of history. Insursta the dragon looked at the Black Knight bowing their heads and couldn't help but whisper to his companion. Anticipation is not a feeling that the dead should have, Tarkus replied faintly, and even his expression rarely changed. As the noblest vampire of the Manlian family, he was allowed to wear a black noble robe with golden edges in this hall. Standing next to the Insursta dragon who had no status, he looked extremely comical. Madara has begun to act according to the will of the Mercury staff. It's like a curse rather than a goal. The world of the living is nothing in the eyes of the dead. In my opinion, only time, truth, and dust have value. That's why the humans outside call us stubborn skeletons. But the show has just begun. Tarkus, the arrival of the Black Knight today is just an appetizer. Insursta the dragon didn't feel any embarrassment because of his low status. Instead, he was in high spirits. You see, His Majesty summoned the bloodstaff back. It must be because something good has happened. Tarkus didn't say a word. In fact, he already knew what had happened. A week ago, in the territory west of Madara near the kingdom of Erewhon, 2 dark nobles were attacked by humans. One of the vampire's castles was almost completely burned to ashes, leaving behind a large number of traces of purification. Almost no undead creatures could escape. In other words, at least one of the knights of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had sneaked into Madara's territory. For such an incident to happen at this time of the year, he smelled a strong scent of conspiracy. Although such things were not uncommon on the border between Erewhon and Madara, the humans responded to the call of the Holy Cathedral, and the undead plundered each other's territory. Between the two sides, there were often knights privately forming armies to invade each other's territory. However, since Erewhon's Oberg VI ascended to the throne, Madara switched from defense to offense and gradually took the initiative in the war. But today was different. The peace treaty between Erewhon and Madara had only been signed for a year, and it was said that the human kingdom was caught in a civil war. Obviously, they wouldn't start a war at this time. In that case, it was very suspicious as to who was trying to fish in troubled waters. The indifferent vampire narrowed his remaining eye. He raised his head and saw that the Dark Lord who had taught Erewhon a painful lesson in Karsuk was like what the Insursta dragon had said. The bloodstaff, dressed in a blood-red robe, the king of necromancers, Jug, slowly walked into the center of the hall. Your Majesty, I have brought news that is not so delightful. Those lowly humans are now challenging Your Majesty in Madara's territory. The pain that the war a year ago brought to them seems to have faded from those stubborn human nobles. Today, I am here to ask for your permission to let me bring them new horror. The hoarse voice of the bloodstaff echoed under the vault of the holy palace of Eliudner, but Tarkus and the Insursta dragon narrowed their eyes slightly. Brando threw the letter in Delphian's hand lightly in front of her. He looked at this woman carefully. In fact, he had already met her once at the exchange of trade winds, but at that time, he had only seen her from afar. He did not look at her as closely as he did today. He had to admit that her beauty was enough to make anyone admire her. Among all the women he had seen, only Princess Graphene could compare to her. But compared to her vicious heart, Her Highness the Princess was as innocent as a child. Miss Delphian, although I don't know how I have offended you, but you don't have to take revenge on me at all costs. Lord Veronica asked you to pass this message to me. Speaking of which, it seems that you Cruise people do not intend to start a war with us Erewhon people. Instead, you want to ask me for a favor. He paused for a moment and could not help but say sarcastically, if she knew that you are here to give me a condition, I'm afraid she would not be satisfied. The Prime Minister's daughter did not say a word. She stared at him coldly, but the hatred in her eyes was like that of a venomous snake. This made Brando frown. Even in his wildest dreams, he could not imagine how he had offended her to make her look like she hated him so much. But fortunately, he did not need this woman to speak. He took a look at the letter, and he already knew the contents of the letter. He raised his head, silently estimating which historical event this was. The Bloodstaff self-directed drama had happened before in history. He had thought that because history had been completely changed, all of this would not happen again. He did not expect that the unlucky corpse wizard king would still send this trouble to him. But Brando squinted his eyes, and was not too worried in his heart. To him this was a rare opportunity. It was rare to encounter a familiar historical event, and such a good thing might not happen again in the future. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 686. At the end of the Swords Year, there was indeed a second invasion by the Bloodstaff in history. The unruly corpse wizard king colluded with Count Ranner to create trouble in an attempt to create an excuse to invade Elson. The deeper intention was to break away from the control of the Supreme Emperor of Madara, or at least weaken his prestige. So this was a good show directed by the Bloodstaff. It was just that some people had planned the opening of the show, but did not expect the final outcome. The Bloodstaff that once swept through the eastern region of Karsuk completely buried itself in this war. First, it was defeated by the allied forces of Ikki, Ura, and Duke Viro. Then, in the process of retreating to the Land of Spiders, it was ambushed by the army of the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, who claimed that she was unwilling to submit to the Mercury Staff, and then died. Not long after its death, the territory it originally ruled in the Blood Forest was divided, and Sursta inherited the largest part of it. Then, the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, also surrendered to the Supreme Emperor of Madara after a symbolic resistance. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed as if the corpse wizard king had dug a hole and buried himself in it. Before Sursta left Awin, he had secretly communicated with Count Ranner. But in the next moment, this lovely count went to the Bloodstaff to conspire with him. Perhaps only the Bloodstaff's empty, dark corroded mind of the corpse wizard would think that there was nothing fishy about this. The Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, was also a big suspect, but this was not something Brando was concerned about. What moved him was that he realized that this September conflict in history would bring him a huge opportunity. It might even allow him to completely solve the trouble in the southern region in one fell swoop. If his plan was successful, then Her Highness would have at least 1 to 2 years of development after unifying the southern region. Even before the Emperor of Madara was ready, if Erwin was prepared to deal with the war in advance, maybe the new Black Rose would seriously consider the route to the west. Brando was lost in thought for a moment. His finger tapped lightly on the envelope. Only he could see the opportunity in the letter. He clearly remembered this point in history. During the autumn moon of the Year of the Sword, the Bloodstaff would choose to head east from today's Buchi and enter Grimoires from the Silman region. They would then meet up with Count Ranner at the border of the northern Tosankade forest. After that, Bloodstaff's army marched north to attack Kirkle, the capital of Grimoires, in an attempt to open up a path to Viro from the west of Lake Valendan. However, the undead army was ambushed by the allied forces of Ikki, Ura, and Duke Viro near Shallow Water Town. The Bloodstaff was killed by Yalvit in the process of retreating to the Land of Spiders. The Princess and Duke Arek's army also attacked the capital of Ranner's territory, Magiton. The September conflict started in the month of harvest and lasted for more than a month until the middle of the month of autumn. After that, both Madara and Erwin refused to admit that it was a war. They reached a consensus in writing that it was a border conflict where the lords privately plundered and retaliated. Brando personally participated in the war as a player at that time. Not long after that, Count Ranner was expelled and fled to Madara. He joined in Sursta's forces, but that was no longer something that Brando cared about. He raised his head and stared at the huge map of Erwin's southern border that was hung on one side of the wall of the castle hall in Abes. His gaze was always wandering on one of the lines. That line started from Silman in the south and reached Kirkle Castle in the north. In history, the Bloodstaff had once attacked Kirkle, but this time, Brando obviously would not give the Lich so many benefits. The southern border was now in the princess's pocket, and Brando was not so generous as to give his things to others. The key was that this was the best opportunity to rope in Duke Grimoires, and Duke Viro would definitely join in. Now, he could only hope that Old Man Arek would also join in the chaos. If their allied forces were completely destroyed, then the war in the southern border would in fact be over. Brando's gaze stopped at the Silman area where the war started, and he suddenly thought of some people. Those people should have gained a foothold by now. Then the plan was set. He curled his finger and lightly tapped on the table. This action made Amandina, who was at the side, tremble slightly. Amandina, who was familiar with him, knew very well that he had already decided on the next plan. As expected, Brando raised his head. He first glanced at Delphian, who was pressed down on the chair by Scarlet. This woman made him a little puzzled, but the fact that she ordered her subordinates to hurt Freya angered him even more. The Valkyrie had come to him with bandages on and told him not to be impulsive, but it was precisely because of this that Brando's heart became even colder. He pondered for a moment. A murderer should be prepared to be killed. This woman had sinister intentions. Although she did not succeed in the end, at least she had attempted to kill. Moreover, it was not her own conscience that made her stop. If Scarlet was not present at the time, Freya and even the Roman would not have been able to escape death. However, envoys were not killed in a war between two armies. Although this envoy had done some despicable things, Brando was not so petty as to argue with a woman. Besides, if he killed Delphian just like that, Freya would most likely feel guilty. He did not want to leave any grudges with the future Valkyrie because of this small matter. However, he could avoid death, but he could not escape punishment. Moreover, Brando believed that sometimes death was a kind of relief. This venomous woman was glaring at him with a face full of resentment. She was the daughter of Prime Minister Cruz, and her status seemed to be very high. If she died, there would be a real war between Erwin and Cruz. Brando stared at her. No matter how he looked at it, he felt that her deep purple eyes were filled with hatred. "My lord." Amandina seemed to have seen through his thoughts and asked in a low voice, "I don't want to see this woman for the time being. She was born with such a beautiful face, but her heart is disgustingly ugly. Take her to the water dungeon under Abbey's castle. I believe Lady Veronica will give me a satisfactory answer." Brando replied coldly. "Water dungeon?" Amandina asked in disbelief. She could not help but look at Delphian with some sympathy. Compared to that, perhaps it would be better to be executed directly. The dungeons under Coldwood Castle were built during Grodin's time. The water dungeons at the bottom were covered with a layer of iron cages, and the water was waist deep. It was impossible for anyone to change the water in the dungeons. There were countless corpses of humans, rats, and other creatures in there. There were also some things that she could not bring herself to mention. She could not possibly ask the prisoners to give up on excreting, right? It was hard for her to imagine what would happen to the daughter of the Prime Minister after being locked up for a few days. A woman as beautiful as her was impossible not to love beauty. Besides, Brando wanted to wait for Veronica's reply. In other words, if Veronica did not give him a reply, it was estimated that Delphian would be locked up for the rest of her life. Amandina felt her hair stand on end just thinking about it. But she could not help but sigh when she looked at Delphian. This woman only had herself to blame. When she had ordered people to hurt Freya, the entire territory had almost been stirred up. "I understand." She nodded and replied softly. Then she was ready to order the soldiers to drag the daughter of the Prime Minister away. But it was at this moment that Lorena, who was restrained to a chair by the Shire's spell, saw this scene and could not help but plead, "My lord." Although she was the one who had actually hurt Freya, she and her fiancé were treated the best. The other Cruz knight were directly tied to the ground, while she and Filas were just confined to chairs by magic. From this point, the female knight could vaguely feel that the count in front of her did not seem to be such an unreasonable person. Besides, as a knight from the army, she knew very well what kind of place the dungeon was. Delphian, who was born in a noble family, would never stay in that kind of place for more than a day. But she did not expect that as soon as she opened her mouth, Brando interrupted her and said, "Lady Lorena, I know you are an upright and kind knight. You know very well what would have happened if I had not been able to stop that scene at the time. If Freya had died, or even if she had been seriously injured, I would have immediately declared war on Cruz." He glanced at the female knight. In fact, he let Lorena and Filas sit in chairs not because he saw that they were innocent, but because Lorena and Filas were still somewhat famous in history. They were the few Cruz commanders that Brando appreciated more. The title of the upright Lorena was still circulating on the earth even after the Holy War, and he believed that she would not attack Freya for no reason. "Don't doubt my ability," he paused and continued. "Lady Lorena, I'm sure you're already well aware of my relationship with the Ash Sword Saint. If Erwin had become enemies with Cruz because of this, then what awaited the two kingdoms would have been a bloody end. Just because of this woman's selfishness, hundreds and thousands of people would have died because of it. Compared to my current indifference and ruthlessness, the Prime Minister's daughter in front of you is more like a cold-blooded executioner. Besides, when she ordered you and Mr. Filas to attack, I'm afraid she didn't consider your safety. You should be well aware of this. If you had attacked at that time, you would have been in enemy territory. If you had failed, it's not hard to imagine what kind of situation you would have faced. In fact, if you hadn't met me, I'm afraid you would have met with misfortune by now, Brando continued. Lorena was slightly stunned and could not help but fall silent. What a bandit's logic. Cruz's war with Erwin was just your own decision, my lord. But you can put it on my head and make me an executioner, my lord. Delphian was pressed into the chair and sneered. Brando looked at the woman with some pity and replied slowly, compared to a woman like you who has no normal human feelings, it is indeed difficult for you to understand the kinship and bonds between people. After all, these things are too complicated and profound for you. You have cold blood flowing in your veins, but I can declare war on Kurlutz for Freya's sake. That's the biggest difference between you and me. Delphian seemed to have been stabbed in the ribs. She could not help but bite her lower lip and stare at him viciously. Miss Delphian, I can endorse Count Tanagel's words and ensure that he is not an alarmist. Princess Grafine, who was watching silently from the side, suddenly interjected at this time. She replied quietly, Mr. Brando is right. This has nothing to do with reason or interest. The murderer must pay with his life. Erwin has the ability to protect its people. Brando turned his head. He looked at the princess with some gratitude. Although he knew that there was some element of buying people's hearts, at least she stood up and chose to stand with him in front of outsiders at this time. It meant that she would always be on his side in this matter. Not only Brando, but even Lorena and Filas could not help but look at the eldest princess of Erwin in surprise. Both of them looked surprised and subconsciously re-evaluated the count's position in the princess's heart. It was obvious that they were more intimate than the rumors outside said. Delphian stared coldly at Princess Grafine. She trembled slightly and replied in a venomous tone, I understand, but you'd better kill me. Otherwise, I swear that as long as you don't kill me one day, I will definitely make a move on the people around you. You won't have the chance, Miss Delphian, Brando replied coldly. I know what you're thinking, but I have a lot more brains than you think. At this point, he was too lazy to deal with this venomous woman anymore. So he turned back to her and said, Amandina, take her away. Everyone must be responsible for their own actions. Amandina nodded slightly, then led the accompanying soldiers to take the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Cruz Empire away. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 687. Delphian was unusually quiet as she was taken away, but she kept staring at him with eyes like a viper, which made Brando shudder a little. To be honest, if it weren't for his relationship with Veronica, he really would have put this woman to death. Anyway, a bad relationship with the Prime Minister of the Empire was inevitable, and he thought that Cruz's people might not really dare to declare war on Erwin over a woman. Lorena watched Delphian being taken away, and the female knight wanted to say something but couldn't for a moment. As an emissary of the Empire, it would naturally be disgruntled to be dealt with in this way, but the problem was that she didn't seem to have any right to be disgruntled. She thought for a long time before saying weakly, My lord, I hope you can carefully consider the way you get along with the Empire. Of course I understand, but it also depends on who it is. I naturally know the difference between friend and foe. I can only say that Lady Veronica chose the wrong person to complete the wrong mission this time. Brando replied. He gestured to the Shire, and Lorena and Filas, who were imprisoned in their chairs by magic, suddenly felt their bodies loosen. The female knight was still able to maintain her composure, but her fiancé couldn't help but let out a long sigh immediately, staring at Brando with a little fear. He had suffered a lot at the hands of the Prime Minister's daughter along the way because of his glib tongue, but he didn't expect such a terrifying woman to be locked up in the dark prison by this inhumane guy. He thought for a moment, and if it were him, he would certainly be reluctant to do so. Delphian's beauty was famous throughout the Empire. Thinking of this, Filas couldn't help but look at Brando with some fear again. In his eyes, he had already decided that the other party was probably one of those legendary barbarians in the wilderness. No, he should be called a chieftain. No matter how beautiful a woman was, she was meaningless to such a boor. And in some knight novels, it was even mentioned that these barbarians seemed to prefer men. The young knight's thoughts diverged to this extent, and he couldn't help but take another look at the Shire, who had been controlling him and Lorena with magic, with a thoughtful look on his face. Of course, Brando didn't know that some strange thoughts were running through the mind of the famous idiot, and almost unbelievably lucky gigolo in history in front of him, this title wasn't given to him, but the real title of Cruz's #1 lucky knight in history. First of all, he defeated many outstanding children from various noble families in Cruz, and married Lorena, Cruz's future's most talented beauty. Lorena's future achievements in Cruz could even stand shoulder to shoulder with Freya's in Erewhon, and because she had a higher starting point, her achievements far beyond that of Lorena's. If he remembered correctly, Lorena and Vahina later succeeded to the position of Azure Sky's Legion commander. This was enough to surprise people, but Filas's luck was more than that. Unlike all the other noble children who grew up in intrigue, this guy's process of inheriting the title could be said to be smooth sailing. As the only son of Prince Barano, there were no competitors, and even the lack of pressure from the collateral branches. Such a twisty road to the title could be said to be enough to make everyone around him green with envy. Later, our Mr. Knight participated in the Holy War at the call of His Majesty the Emperor, and then miraculously spent a considerable period of time in the front line of a hail of bullets without any war on the Eastern Front. After that, he inexplicably ushered in a series of incredible victories, and finally, his accumulated military achievements allowed him to ascend to the throne of the Imperial Legion commander. He was known as the Legion commander who was picked up. Later, as time passed, Mr. Filas had long been in power, and his story had long become the most legendary story among the bards. Now, the legendary couple in this legendary story was sitting in front of him. They, Lorena, was just a small knight captain under Veronica, and Filas was still an idle playboy. The journey of the two had not even begun, and he was more like a legendary figure in front of them. At least after the Battle of Ampere Seal, Brando's reputation in Cruz was not limited to just being a sword saint. Brando looked at the two people carefully. After a while, he picked up the envelope on the table again, glanced at it, and asked the female knight, "Lady Lorena, may I ask, when did the people of Cruz become aware of this?" Lorena looked at him, slightly startled, and realized what he was asking. She frowned and replied with a businesslike expression, "2 months ago, my lord." This question and answer was actually talking about the second matter mentioned in Veronica's letter to him. Compared to the first matter, which was neither painful nor itchy, the second matter was much trickier in Brando's opinion. Things had to start with the Battle of Ampere Seal. In that battle, Erewhon's people finally shattered the 3 doors of flame and sent the demons back to their hometown under the Sulphur River. Of course, Brando also experienced this part of the story himself. The demon army was defeated and fled in all directions, and then completely dispersed by the Silver Elves and the Highland Knight, as well as the craftsman mages who arrived later. But there was still a small number of them who survived and escaped into the wilderness of Erewhon. This small number caused a huge problem for the people of Cruz. Originally, the whole thing should have come to an end after Cruz's people were forced to completely retreat from the port of Ampere Seal for the sake of saving face. But perhaps no one would have thought that history would develop like this. About the month of the first lunar month, the monks from the Holy Cathedral of Fire found that the 3 doors of flame were missing to varying degrees after thoroughly cleaning up the battlefield. These missing doors of flame were quickly sent back to Cruz for the high-ranking priests to identify. Only half a month later, the news that the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire was shrouded in a nightmare was confirmed. The missing parts of the 3 doors of flame were almost enough to form a new portal, so it was obvious. In other words, there was at least one or more groups of demons, cave dwellers, cultists, or something similar from the underground of Jorgendy Ridge with these fragments and were preparing to do something bad in Erewhon's territory. For the Holy Cathedral of Fire, this was simply a ridiculous joke. Or rather, it was a resounding slap to the face of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Even Brando couldn't help but be a little dumbfounded when he saw the news, let alone the others. Although it was an almost open secret that the Holy Cathedral of Fire was infiltrated by All for One, he didn't expect the other party to be so useless. It was no wonder that the power core of the Cruz Empire was leaning more and more towards the royal power day by day. In the face of such a useless enemy, it was difficult for Her Majesty the Silver Queen to not win. Brando thought silently for a moment, then shook the letter in his hand. Now he was almost certain that Veronica must be having trouble sleeping and eating at the moment. If possible, he was afraid that the army commander would rather not send this letter to him. The Cruz Empire had never been so humiliated in a century, and it was continuous humiliation. But the problem was that there was now a group of people who were wandering around with these fragments of the portal, and could find an energy core to rebuild the portal at any time. Veronica couldn't turn a blind eye to it. This was actually not a serious problem for Erwin. After all, if they could get rid of 3 portals, they could naturally get rid of an incomplete temporary portal. But it was a big problem for the Holy Cathedral of Fire, no matter when or where the portal was built by these cultists. Even if it was built in a random pigsty in Erwin's countryside, the Holy Cathedral of Fire would not be able to raise its head in front of the other major holy cathedrals for at least half a century. As for the Holy War, it might be better to just hang up the truce sign and hand over the benefits in their hands. Besides, the problem of face was secondary. Such an incident would be the biggest blow to the reputation of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and would inevitably cause many people's faith to waver. Brando never thought that the largest number of farmers and craftsmen among the believers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would have strong faith, and once faith collapsed, it was difficult to rebuild. But this was not the biggest disaster. For the people of Cruz, the worst possibility was that these cultists would bring the fragments of the portal back to the Cruz Empire. For the sake of Martha, just imagining that scene would probably give the higher-ups of the Holy Cathedral of Fire nightmares at night. Not to mention that the demons would study and replicate these fragments. Although this possibility was very small, once it was successful, the higher-ups of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would probably have to atone for their sins with death. If it were not such a serious situation, perhaps the arrogant Greensword Saint would not have hoped that he would prioritize protecting the Holy Cathedral of Fire. To be honest, as a person of Erwin, Brando was happy to see Cruz lose face. But Veronica's words actually meant that she hoped that he would help out on account of their past friendship. If one were to say who had the most real power in the southern part of Erwin, it would naturally be him and Her Royal Highness, who had the support of the Highland Knight, Duke Anthony, and the Southern Legion. That was why this letter was sent to him and Princess Grafine. Thinking of Veronica, Brando could not help but sigh. To be honest, the female commander of the Cruz Empire had left a good impression on him. Besides, there was also Vahina, and he knew that in private the arrogant young lady actually regarded him as a friend. After you found out, the Azure Skies Legion immediately entered Erwin? He thought for a moment and asked again. No, in fact, it was a big shot of the Holy Cathedral of Fire who asked Lady Veronica for help. I don't know exactly who it was. Because this matter is so important, not many people even within the Empire know about it. Lorena replied. Brando could not help but shake his head. You also know that it is important, but the person who was sent as an envoy seems to be a bit lacking in consideration. The female knight was slightly startled and immediately showed a look of hesitation. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 688. What's the matter? Brando saw her expression. If you have something to say, you might as well say it, Miss Knight. I've heard of your reputation, so I won't equate you with someone else. Miss Delphian volunteered to go, and Lady Veronica didn't know about what happened between her and you. I only noticed it later by accident. I just didn't expect her to be so resolute. In fact, it's all my fault. I shouldn't have taken any chances with such an important matter. Lorena sighed and replied with a little self-blame. Brando was suddenly curious. How so? You know what's going on? He couldn't help but be curious. Anyone who was targeted by a crazy woman for no reason would feel creeped out. In fact, he still felt very uncomfortable when he thought of Delphian's resentful eyes. It felt as if he had done something unforgivable to her. But for Marcia's sake, there was nothing between him and her. Brando remembered clearly that he had only met her from afar when he was at the front line against the calamity of wolves in the Black Forest. Actually, it's like this. Lorena was also a little embarrassed when it came to this matter. She sorted out her thoughts and then told him about Delphian in detail. Although Viscount Elman died at the hands of Andesha, Miss Delphian has always thought that you deliberately left them behind. Plus, she has always been in love with Viscount Elman, which is well known in the Empire. The Viscount's death was a great blow to Miss Delphian. This is really an unexpected disaster, Lady Lorena. Brando smiled bitterly. After listening to this ridiculous story, he suddenly felt a little speechless. This was a disaster from the heavens. If he had known that he would offend such a paranoid lady, He would have carefully sent Viscount Elman out of the country. He would never have given Andesha a chance to take advantage of him. I'm sorry, my lord. Miss Delphian, she? Lorena seemed to want to further plead for the Prime Minister's daughter. But Brando interrupted her first. I understand what you mean, Ms. Lorena. But even so, she shouldn't have attacked innocent people. This isn't revenge, it's just venting her anger. He thought for a moment and added, I will consider your words, but not now. It's better to let that young lady calm down. You don't want her to ruin Lady Veronica's plan, do you? Lorena was startled, and then it occurred to her that this was indeed a possibility. According to Delphian's current mentality, as long as she could get revenge, she wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice the Empire. After thinking for a moment, she couldn't help but sigh. I understand. Then let's continue, Brando replied. Since not many people in the Empire know about your operation this time, then there shouldn't be many people from Azure Skies, right? May I know how many people you have? I'm sorry, this is confidential, Count. Lorena was a little embarrassed, but she still refused Brando's question. It's okay, I was just asking casually. Brando narrowed his eyes. In fact, he could already be sure that the Azure Skies that sneaked into Erewhon might only be a small elite group. As mentioned in the information he received, it might be an elite knight regiment under the Azure Skies. But there was no need to delve into this matter. He asked again. The letter says that the Holy Cathedral of Fire suspects that the fragments may be with Grand Duke Arek. Is this true? The female knight nodded and said, Yes, since entering Erewhon, Lady Veronica has received information that matches this speculation. Maybe it was Grand Duke Arek who colluded with the cultists and demons to steal the fragments of the portal that day. I heard that Grand Duke Arek and Count Ranner have recently formed an alliance, which means that this batch of fragments may have been transported to Magiton. It's possible. Lorena frowned. But the news from the Holy Cathedral of Fire indicates that the fragments may not have stayed in Magiton, but moved north. Do you have a way to track the location of those fragments? Brando was stunned. He looked back at the female knight, thinking that these cruise people weren't here to make fun of him. If they had the ability to locate those fragments, why would they need him? But Lorena's answer immediately answered the question in his heart. No, it's just some trivial divination and prophecies, my lord. Brando then realized. Then north, where north? He suddenly asked. This. The female knight was speechless. How could she know such a thing? But her naturally serious personality still made her reply. I'm sorry, I don't know either. But she didn't expect Brando to interrupt her and say, It's okay, maybe I know. He looked back and his eyes fell on the point marked with the name Magiton on the huge map. From here to the north it was the vast misty forest and further north into Lantern Island. His eyes moved up quickly, the Ansara Forest, the Goldfinch Mountains, the mountains on the north shore of Lake Valendon. A bolt of lightning flashed through his mind, as if bringing with it a fire seed called wisdom. He suddenly raised his head and realized what these demons or cultists or Grand Duke Arek wanted to do. To rebuild a portal, first of all, a lot of magic power must be needed. Preferably an energy core. The cruise people had fire gems. Then what about Grand Duke Arek? Brando's gaze finally stopped. There on the map was a line of fine text marked in rough font. Falling Needle Hills Avenue. Falling Needle Hills Avenue, Stain Frost Forest Maze, Heart of the Dragon. Your Highness. As soon as Brando walked out of the hall, he found Princess Griffine standing outside the porch. The half-elf girl stood by the stone window, looking out at the hills in the direction of the Gars River beach. After a moment of surprise, he immediately bowed his head and saluted. The princess turned around. She seemed to have been waiting for him here for a long time. After looking at him quietly, she asked slowly, Your Excellency, how should we deal with the relationship with the Kurletzians next? Are we going to help them this time? This time we must help, Your Highness, Brando answered truthfully. Huh. Princess Griffine looked back with a little surprise. Why? I remember you don't like them very much? Actually, I already have some ideas. Falerne followed Brando out of the hall and let Brando take the coat and cloak from her. Brando looked out of the window. The undulating ridgeline was covered by a green forest, and above it were snow-like clouds and blue skyline. He looked at the flock of migratory birds flying away and said, Now is a good opportunity to persuade Grand Duke Viro to join our side. If we're lucky, he added, we might be able to get Grimoires to join us. Grafine was not stupid. On the contrary, her wisdom was one of the best among the royal family members of Erwin's generation. Of course, she could understand Brando's meaning. But the girl looked at the cloak in Brando's hand and asked curiously, Your Highness, where are you going? In her memory, although the young man in front of her had become a count, he had never cared about his appearance. If he was not going out, he would rarely wear a coat, let alone a cloak or shawl. Therefore, she was keenly aware of this from Brando's subtle movements. Brando did not intend to hide it. He nodded and said, I suddenly have an idea. An idea? Yes, Brando replied. It seems that Lady Martha is still on our side this time. If all goes well, Princess Magadol will be able to wake up. Princess Grafine was stunned for a moment, then her silver eyes revealed a look of extreme joy. She did not even bother to maintain her composure as she blurted out, Really? When have I ever lied to you, Your Highness? Brando was also very happy, as if the problems that had been troubling him for the past few days were all solved in an instant. He had to admit that Duke Arek and Count Ranner had given him a big gift this time. In fact, he had already discussed it with Bosley and Amandina. To wake Magadol up was easy, but also difficult. The nun princess was not human. Her injuries were in fact caused by the destruction of the mana source that drove and maintained her body functions. Alaz herself had also indirectly confirmed this. To restore the mana source, the easiest way was to replace it with a new one. There was only one person in the territory who had mastered this technique. Brando had not forgotten that Alaz had put the Titan's core into his body. However, finding a new mana core was a problem. But Duke Arek's current movements immediately gave him an answer. Because he had been busy participating in and planning Erwin's civil war, he had almost forgotten that he was once a player. The Falling Needle Hills main path, the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth instance dungeon, just so happened to have the most suitable mana source. The Heart of the Dragon. Duke Arek obviously went there for this thing, although Brando did not know how this guy knew about the existence of the Heart of the Dragon. But what he had to do now was obviously to find this treasure before the other party. Also, if those idiots really did build a portal there, he would not hesitate to destroy it. This way, not only would he be able to complete Veronica's mission, but he would also be able to clear up a lot of things here. For Brando, there was nothing more practical than this gift. Seeing the confident look on his face, Princess Grafine took a light breath and asked cautiously, Are you going now? No, Brando shook his head. Before that, I have to take care of something first. What is it? Brando grinned and replied, Private matter. P.S. Today's third watch is 10,000. In addition, I strongly recommend the novel by the Roaring Lord Wind and Moon, Heaven's Drive. The book number is 02493250. The unscrupulous introduction is as follows. This book has all kinds of cute points that are enough to attract you. Original introduction. Who knows how many people's bones have to be stepped on to reach the peak of this world? Well, this is actually a story of a young man leading his sister and Lolita on the road of Magneto, leading the vast number of ability users to become rich and prosperous, and to a better future. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 690. Brando, where are we going? The metal parts on the two warhorses rattled as they moved through the forest one after the other. The female knight on the horse held the reins tightly with one hand and turned her head to look at the surrounding scenery worriedly. The still forest was like an oil painting, with refreshing greenery seeping out from the depths of the background. Sunlight passed through the canopy and scattered on the withered leaves like a curtain of light. The forest was silent, except for the rustling of the horse's hooves on the withered leaves and the sound of metal colliding, which made one's hair stand on end. Freya's face was a little pale. Although she had only suffered minor injuries at the hands of Lorena, and was fine after Muriel's treatment. But the long journey on horseback after losing blood was still a little too much for her. Tired? Brando looked back at her and asked with concern. No, but it's getting dark. If we go any further, we won't be able to return to Schaflund. Freya said with a worried tone. She didn't know why Brando suddenly asked her to go to Schaflund and go deep into Mount Greyhar. A little further ahead was the Black Forest. It's okay. Brando smiled on horseback and didn't seem to care. When it gets dark, we can camp in the wild. With me here, what are you worried about? But Freya's face turned red. But we only have one tent. Brando liked the future Valkyrie like this, so he wasn't in a hurry to answer. When the latter glared at him fiercely, he laughed. Actually, I was lying to you. We'll be there soon. Freya breathed a sigh of relief and then realized that she had been teased. She took a deep breath and resisted the urge to punch the smirking face with difficulty. But she saw that the latter had already tightened the reins and let out a soft sigh, and the warhorse under him stopped. Brando looked around carefully, as if to confirm something. Then, he dismounted from the horse with a whoosh. With one hand on the hilt of his sword, he dragged his cloak and slowly walked forward. Seeing Brando like this, Freya had no choice but to put away her original angry expression and became curious. She saw him rustling the dead leaves as he walked to a tree. Of course, she did not recognize the scientific names of the trees on the labels in the thick literature of scholars. However, she knew that the giant trees with dark trunks were commonly known as ghost trees in Erewhon. Brando, what are you looking at? Brando raised his head and looked at the ebony tree. He was very familiar with these trees, as if he had seen them again after many years of separation. There was a faint sense of intimacy. He thought of something in silence, of all the past, some of which he could not remember clearly, but the memory still flashed through his mind like shards of glittering fragments, like seashells in a sea of sand. Then, he looked away and found the grayish-white boulder not far from where he remembered. The boulder was like a giant egg stuck in the ground at an angle. His eyes followed the uneven surface of the boulder, and he stopped every time he went up. After the third time he saw the forked star-shaped crack. Then he replied, "Nothing. We're here, Freya." "We're here?" Freya could not help but raise her head and look around. After half of the afternoon, the light in the forest grew dimmer and dimmer. She could only see an empty space made up of dark green treetops, twisted tree trunks, and intertwined roots. From this angle, the forest looked more like a semi-enclosed cave with intersecting tunnels leading in all directions. Unlike the other places in Tonajol, the black coniferous forests that were commonly seen in Grinwars and Randner Mountains were rarely seen. Instead, it was covered with large patches of evergreen broad-leaved forests, as if there was a mysterious magic that nourished this ancient forest underground. What is this place? This should be the border of the Black Forest in this direction. Brando took a few steps forward and pushed aside a large patch of shrubs. He noticed that they were almost at the top of the mountain. Looking to the east, there were black ridges that went from south to north, like the backs of several dragons. He stretched out his hand and pointed in that direction and said, "To the east is the Eversong Forest. You should have heard of it, right?" "The mountains of Chablis?" Freya asked curiously. The mountains of Chablis were a famous landmark in the southern part of Erewhon. The beautiful scenery of the Eversong Forest had always been a tourist destination, so she had heard of it even when she was in Bucci. "Yes," Brando nodded. "But to be more precise, it should be the border between Tosancade Forest and the Eversong Forest. The Tusk Fortress is located in that direction, and it's the southern border of Erewhon." After saying that, he stared in that direction without saying a word. Surrounded by clouds and mist was a vast wilderness. The dark forest was scattered all over the place, and it was a rare sight for explorers. Any player who saw such a scene would be filled with ambition, just like a sailor trying to conquer the magnificent sea. "But why did we come here?" "Boo, Brando, what are you doing?" The Night Maiden was puzzled. She did not understand why Brando would bring her to such a desolate place. But when she saw Brando taking off his cloak and coat, she was startled. She subconsciously placed her hand on the hilt of her sword and stared at him nervously. Brando stopped and looked at the future goddess of war in confusion. "What are you thinking about? Why are you taking off your clothes?" "Of course I'm going to climb down from here. What are you thinking?" Brando replied snappily. "Am I not worthy of your trust? Come and help me get my clothes. Wait here for me, idiot." Freya's face turned as red as blood. She lowered her head as if she wanted to find a hole to hide in. But when she heard Brando's request, the goddess of war dilly-dallied for a long time before she unbuckled all kinds of leather buckles and climbed down from the horse. If she dismounted at this speed in the academy, she would probably get a negative score in the riding test. Then she took the coat from Brando with trembling hands. Where are you going? She held the coat in a daze and asked gingerly like a clumsy maid. You'll know later. Brando replied. Then she looked up and saw him walking to the side. He pulled out a rope from the bag on the horse and tied it to the ghost tree from before. She saw him let go of the rope little by little and slowly walk to the edge of the cliff. Then he looked down and threw the other half of the rope down. Brando, what's down there? The goddess of war was slightly stunned and finally realized what Brando was going to do. Brando raised his head and looked at her from that direction. He put a finger to his lips and shook his head at the girl from the countryside of Wuxia. Then he grabbed the rope with one hand and suddenly jumped down. Be careful. Freya could not help but shout in a low voice. But the shout seemed to be dragged further and further away from his ears. The biting cold wind above the cliff made him squint his eyes, and when he finally managed to distinguish the scenery in front of him, he felt that the fog below the cliff was very close to him, just like the illusion of being close to the surface of the water when he jumped into the water. Then with a whoosh he felt himself falling into the clouds. Brando hurriedly grabbed some ropes. With his strength as a gold ranker, he naturally did not need to climb down the rope bit by bit. But the last time he came here was at least 10 years ago, and nearly 100 years had passed in the game. He was afraid that he remembered the wrong location, so he brought the rope for insurance. After all, before he really activated his elemental activation, he could not fly in the sky. Brando stared at the cliff. In just a few seconds, a platform protruding out of the bushes swept past his sight. His reaction was quick. He clenched his fist, and the rope in his hand immediately tightened with a bang. The strong reaction force pulled him back and forth in the air. There was a burnt smell on the rope, but he did not feel anything strange in his hand. The physical fitness of a gold ranker had long exceeded the range of what a normal person could imagine. He raised his head and looked up. The location of the platform was not much different from what he remembered. It was more than 10 meters away from him. But this distance was almost non-existent to him. Brando gently swung the rope close to the cliff, then grabbed the jagged rocks and climbed up lightly like a monkey. The platform covered with bushes was almost exactly the same as what he remembered. Brando looked around. The rock that protruded from the mountainside was about half the size of a basketball court. But in fact it was much wider, but the dense trees and vines blocked most of his sight. He carefully walked in a direction according to his memory, then pulled away the thick and tangled vines. With a crash accompanied by the sound of soil rolling down, Brando did not use much strength to pull away the dead branches and rotten leaves. Sure enough, a cone-shaped stone slab was revealed below. This stone slab was about his height and 2 people wide. It was a bit like the stone statue of Wisdom one that was commonly seen in forests everywhere. But it was not the image of Misokai, the weaver of magic and storm, but a black moon. The silent moon, Erwin's 7th moon. This moonless moon could never be observed from the sky, but it really existed in history. Brando did not say a word. He cleaned up the vines on the platform one by one, and then revealed another 11 similar stone tablets below. On each stone tablet there was a moon, which in turn represented the flowing fate and the source of magic in Erwin's sky. This place was the Temple of Fate. Or rather, it was where the players called it the Class Change Center. Brando had once checked the information. These stone tablets were built by a race even older than the Myurnas. The purpose of their construction seemed to be to stabilize the original Martha's Law of Tiamat. In the whole of Wonde, such stone tablets existed in many places, but they were all built in extremely hidden places. For example, the one in Tonajil was built on the border of the Black Forest in Mount Greyhar, and had been buried for countless years. However, when Brando went to these places in the game, these stone tablets had already been cleaned up by the players in front of him, so he did not have to waste so much time on them like today. He carefully looked at the thin veins on the ground in the center of the stone tablet array, then raised his head, and his gaze followed them to the center of the platform. These rune lines and veins with a metallic glow were very familiar to him. They were very similar to the energy transmission magic circles he saw under Valhalla, as if they were made by the same civilization. This doubt flashed through Brando's mind. Then he put away his thoughts and walked to the center of the platform. Although these stone tablets in Woned contained all kinds of secrets, they only had one function in the game. That was to let the players receive their own elemental activation missions. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation.